I went to the wedding of a younger coworker. During the event, the bride made a rude comment about how people who are less educated and poor should cut ties with my husband. She looked down on me because I dropped out of school. Instead of stopping her, my coworker, the groom, joined in and mocked me too. At that moment, I decided to cut them out of my life and reach out to someone else. I promised myself that I would make them regret judging people just based on their education. My name is Gwen, and I'm 32 years old. I grew up in a middle-class family, neither rich nor poor, as the only son of working parents. Unlike most of my classmates who were focused on high school, I was busy looking for a job. Both of my parents went to college, but I was eager to start working as soon as I could. At first, they were confused, but later they supported my choice, saying it was my life to live. I started working as a factory laborer in my hometown, then I became a painting contractor site supervisor. Now, I've been working at a large machinery company for 7 years. I'm the service department manager, which means I visit clients to help install, repair, and maintain machinery. Today, I have more repair and maintenance visits to make. As I drive toward the freeway in my company car, my work phone rings. Seeing the company name on the screen makes me feel a bit stressed. I pull over and call back immediately, only to find out that it's another complaint from a client. I apologize and tell them I'll be there right away. I bow my head in apology, even though the caller can't see me. Now, I have to rearrange my schedule to deal with this complaint first. It looks like it's going to be a long day. After 7 p.m., I return to the office and see Theodore from my service department already back and chatting happily with a colleague from sales. I say, "I'm back." Theodore quickly goes to his seat and starts working on his computer. Each branch office has a small team, and in this branch, it's just Theodore, who is 2 years younger than me, and me in the service department. "Hey, Theodore, do you have a minute? What is it?" I could hear the irritation in his voice. "We got a complaint from one of your clients this morning. I would fix it myself, but we both need to go tomorrow to apologize." "Why did you leave it unattended for 2 days? I had plans both days. The CEO over there is always bossing me around. Maybe they should rethink how they treat me." As usual, Theodore just gave excuses and complained about the client. "I'm going to report this to the area manager." I had to step in and fix a client's issue. Of course, I have to report it. Theodore, without any remorse, scoffed and said, "So you're reporting on me again just because you're jealous of my education? You exaggerate things in your reports." He thinks I'm jealous of him because I dropped out of college. I graduated from a prestigious university. Theodore used to be polite and humble, but once he found out I was a dropout, his attitude changed completely. I wouldn't mind if he did his job right, but there are too many complaints from his clients, and it's a headache. The next day, we both went to the client to apologize. The client's president was aggressive and said, "What are you doing here? Your job is to fix this." I'm used to people being tough in industrial settings, but Theodore, who has no field experience, just stood there in silence. After I calmed the angry client down and talked about future improvements, Theodore finally mumbled a soft, "I'm sorry." I thought he would feel bad about it, but I was wrong. He said, "Why are field workers so uncivilized?" Instead of feeling sorry, Theodore started bashing the client. "That CEO shows how uneducated he is with the way he talks." It was embarrassing to watch. Who made a client that angry? Maybe you should reflect on your work. But my words fell on deaf ears. He replied, "You're just out of touch because you've worked in those environments. Even so, if you're going to be in this line of work, you need to get used to it," Theodore said with a mocking laugh. "What are you talking about? I only took this job to learn some mechanical skills. I don't plan on staying here," he replied. Usually, people like Theodore would work in service for 2 years before moving to sales, but he has been here for 3 years. No one would promote someone with so many complaints to a sales position. He genuinely believes the bad reports are because I'm jealous of him. If that's true, then he should focus on getting better at his service job and show some sincerity to the client. But with his bad attitude, there's no sincerity to talk about. It wouldn't bother me as much if he was at my professional level. I couldn't bring myself to say another word to him. One day, I went on a business trip to set up some machinery. The test run didn't go well because of some glitches, so I had to stay overnight to fix it. The next day, our branch had limited staff, so other local branches would help out with major tasks. While I was looking for a place to eat near the hotel, someone called out to me. "Hey, what are you up to?" I turned around to see Theodore with a woman on his arm. "Oh hey, Theodore." "Good evening," I said, greeting the woman beside him and offering my hand for a handshake. She accepted but didn't say anything. "This is my girlfriend, Selena. She's from around here," Theodore introduced her. I felt like I had seen her somewhere before but didn't think much of it. Theodore then invited me to dinner, and I accepted. After we ordered, Theodore started to brag, "Actually, we just got engaged. She graduated from the same college as me, and her family is pretty wealthy here. She's definitely on a fast track to success." That explained why he wanted to invite me to dinner. He wanted to show off his fiancée. As for Selena, she barely acknowledged me, not making eye contact and only nodding occasionally at Theodore. Dinner ended with Theodore dominating the conversation. When it was time to leave, Theodore excused himself to go to the restroom, leaving me alone with Selena. She broke the silence by saying, "I've heard quite a bit about you from Theodore." Her eyes locked onto mine with a cold stare. I could tell Theodore had been badmouthing me. "You think your managerial role is a big deal, just because you've been at the company a few years longer? Could you please stop blocking Theodore's career?" she said. I knew that the manager position is something anyone can achieve with enough years of service and good performance evaluations. In our situation, the area manager is in charge, and I'm just a senior colleague, which is true. Deciding it was pointless to argue, I let it go. Soon, Theodore returned. Avoiding eye contact and pretending nothing had happened, as I was leaving, I asked him about work for the next day, and he said he'd be helping out at another branch. Something felt off, but I didn't say anything since she was there. The next day, I went to troubleshoot a test run as planned, but Theodore never showed up. I felt uneasy, so I discreetly asked the area manager to look into Theodore's business trip application. It turned out that on the day I met Theodore and his girlfriend, they were supposed to be on a business trip that involved an overnight stay. This was clearly a false claim. The area manager said they would handle the rest, so I left it to them. Later, the date for Theodore and his girlfriend's wedding was set. I wasn't invited, and I felt relieved. However, a week before the ceremony, the area manager asked me to attend in their place. They were supposed to give the main speech but couldn't make it, so they asked me to do it. At first, I declined but then accepted when they insisted. On the wedding day, I arrived early and ran into Theodore and his girlfriend on my way to the waiting room. They looked surprised to see me. "You know, my elite friends and I all have degrees from prestigious universities and work in top-tier companies. I didn't think someone who dropped out would fit in, so we didn't invite you," Theodore scoffed. I replied, "I was asked to speak on behalf of the area manager, who will be late once they arrive." "I'm leaving," I replied. The color drained from their faces. "Are you trying to embarrass me by having a dropout give a speech? If the area manager can make it, there's no need for a speech. Leave now," Theodore commanded. "Cut ties with my husband, you uneducated poor thing," his girlfriend added. They both laughed loudly and walked into the waiting room, leaving me stunned. A new emotion welled up in me, and my whole body started to tremble. If they wanted to sever ties, then so be it. I stayed under the radar and waited for my turn to speak. Finally, it was my turn. I took a deep breath and stepped up to the mic. Even though Theodore and his girlfriend glared at me, urging me to leave, I started my speech. "Congratulations on your wedding. If you thought I'd stick to the usual pleasantries, you're mistaken. Theodore isn't exactly commendable in his job, but since this is a celebratory occasion, I'll use only the highest praises. Top-tier graduate Theodore, you are exceptional at accumulating customer complaints at work. Your unrepentant and arrogant behavior, always blaming our clients, really shows your thick skin. I'm always impressed." "Stop it." Theodore's girlfriend stood up beside a flustered Theodore and shouted, "You're supposed to cut ties with Theodore, quit bullying him." The room started buzzing, but I continued my speech. "All I can say is Theodore is quite the trickster. He's been lying about business trips to hang out with her and claiming expenses for it. That's pretty bold and clear embezzlement. Hey, Cut it out. You're making this up, Theodore shouted, red-faced, and started coming towards me. His girlfriend also stood up and screamed, "What's your evidence for all of this? Are you insane?" The room descended into chaos, prompting the MC to nervously ask me to stop. I thought maybe this was as far as it would go. At that moment, the door swung open with a bang. The area manager and the president of the client company entered the now silent room. Theodore's girlfriend went pale when she saw the president heading straight for the bride and groom's table. "So, you're lying about wanting to quit your job to marry me? Was that a lie?" the president asked. It turned out she had been working as a hostess at the club. I recognized her, because I was once told at the club that she was the one supposed to marry Theodore. I had contacted the area manager to bring the president after realizing her true identity. "I lent you money to quit your job and pay off your debt, then you disappeared and planned to marry someone else." She couldn't come up with any excuses when faced with the calm president. Even Theodore didn't know about her working in the hostess club. Theodore stormed back to his girlfriend and confronted her. "What is going on?" he demanded. She snapped back, "You act all elite, but you're a no-good criminal, even worse than a dropout. That dropout is just jealous of me. It's all lies." The area manager quietly stepped in front of the shouting Theodore. "We have evidence of your actions, and we'll be reporting them to headquarters. You will be suspended until a decision is made." Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Theodore's face turned ashen. The president then said to her, "We'll be speaking through lawyers from now on." The once defiant woman broke down in tears. The MC wisely suspended the ceremony, and the guests were asked to leave. I left the scene with the area manager and the president. Rumor had it that Theodore and his girlfriend had planned to get their marriage certificate after the ceremony, but now that was off. Both families blamed each other and fought over the wedding costs. Theodore was fired for misconduct, and they were calculating the exact amount he had embezzled for restitution. The only downside was that the area manager also received a pay cut for poorly supervising his subordinates. Theodore had scheduled his business trips to coincide with major tasks, like machinery installations, and the area manager had approved these trips. As for the woman, she was facing fraud charges from the CEO for her fake marriage and would likely be tied up in court for a while. Of course, I cut ties with Theodore and haven't spoken to him since that day. As for me, I'm just going to continue living my life with my head held high.
Hannah opened her eyes. Here's another new morning, and how many more are to come? The bright sunbeam slipped onto her pillow, but it brought no happiness. Her heart clenched with longing. I have a roof over my head. My son is growing up and making me proud of him. I have a job also. She persuaded herself, but it didn't help at all. Her gaze drifted over the whitewashed ceiling. Roger had painted it. I wish I could take back that time, even for a few moments. Just to come over, hold him, breathe in his scent, and feel the warmth of his hands. Hannah glanced at her watch and threw back the blanket. There was no time to lie down. It was time for her son to get up for school, and she had to tidy herself up, prepare breakfast, then run to work. Hannah met Roger right after graduation. After school, she went to the city to enter college. Honestly speaking, Hannah didn't want to study. It was boring, with too many lessons, strict teachers, dull paragraphs. Instead, she wanted to wear a beautiful dress and go for a walk with the girls. Hannah didn't want to apply for college, but her mother insisted. "You've decided to work as a maid, and like me to count pennies? No, my daughter, you should keep studying to get a better life than me," said Helen, Hannah's mother. Of course, Helen understood everything perfectly well. Her mother had worked on a farm all her life, taking care of poultry, and she also managed to work part-time. Helen made clothes for her family and acquaintances. The woman's hands were golden. She wanted her only daughter to make it in the world and get a good education. As for Hannah, she chose what seemed to her the simplest speciality, elementary school teacher. She moved into a dorm room with two other girls, Claire and Brianna. Many years have passed, but they were still friends, and Hannah had no one closer than her favourite girls. At first, Hannah was disappointed with her studies. Endless notes made her dizzy, and she even considered withdrawing. But her first school practice changed everything. Hannah found it surprisingly easy to connect with the kids and explain the material. She began studying, not just for getting a diploma, but to become an excellent specialist. And then, in her 3rd year, she met Roger. Claire and Brianna invited her to a disco, and she went to reward herself for good grades and unwind. She didn't notice Roger right away. He was ordinary looking, thin and short. Hannah didn't want to dance with him, but his hopeful look made her give in. She didn't know why she was drawn to him. For the whole evening he stayed close, laughing and talking about his technical school and classmates, and how he looked at her. Naturally, Roger offered to walk her to the dormitory, and she agreed, whispering to her friends that she was leaving. Hannah wasn't afraid. She sensed that this guy was different from all the others, as if made from a different mould. They walked slowly to the dormitory, talking about everything and nothing. Fluffy snowflakes swirled gently. The city glowed with holiday lights, and Hannah felt so calm and content. The next day they went to the park. Roger bought ice cream. "Nobody eats ice cream in winter," Hannah laughed. "And you and I will, to remember this day forever," the guy said, winking. Roger had been visiting Hannah almost every day. He'd pick her up after classes and they'd go for walks. And of course at some point, she even began to study less. How could she concentrate when all her thoughts were with Roger? It was as if they were truly 2 halves of a whole. He'd start a sentence, and she'd finish it. They liked the same movies and music, dreaming of a big, happy family. "I'm the only child in my family, so I want at least 2, Roger said. He adored children, and Hannah felt he'd be a great father. When Hannah graduated, she took Roger to her native village to meet her mother. He made a good impression on his future mother-in-law. During his 3-day visit, Roger didn't sit idle. He chopped a month's worth of firewood, repaired the fence and fixed the sockets. "He's a worker," her mother said. "If you want to marry him, I give my blessing." Thus, when Roger proposed, Hannah was overjoyed, as if wings had sprouted behind her. By then, Roger's mother had married a man, leaving her son a tiny house in suburbia. After selling it, Hannah and Roger bought a small house in her settlement, with a nice yard and bathhouse. They lived happily. Hannah worked as an elementary school teacher, and Roger worked on the farm as an electrician. They lived well, went to town, bought new clothes, and once Roger gave Hannah a bottle of real French perfume. She laughed. "Where would I wear perfume? In the village?" Roger replied, "You're the most beautiful, and you should smell better than anyone else." Hannah kept the perfume. Sometimes she'd take out the heavy bottle, breathe in its fragrance of happiness and serenity, and cry into her pillow. "I should give this perfume to Claire or Brianna. I always cry at the memories. On the other hand, it's all I have left of Roger, of my former happy life. Then there's Luke, a copy of Roger. Eyes, voice, even facial expressions are the same. Can it be? It's fortunate we had time to have a son. Otherwise, I would be alone now." When Hannah was 5 months pregnant, her mother died. She kept complaining about her heart, but didn't hurry to the hospital. Summer, vegetable garden, household chores. She didn't have a minute to spare. Hannah found her mother herself. She came in after work for some reason, and there she was, lying on the floor with her arms spread out, looking up at the ceiling with a slightly surprised expression. God only knows how Hannah survived it all. It was good that Roger was around. She had to live for him and their future child. Hannah gave birth to a healthy, strong boy right on time. They named him Luke. Hannah doted on the baby, and Roger was such a caring and loving father. Luke seemed to grow not by days, but by hours. Admiring his son, Roger talked more and more about having a second child. He still wanted a daughter. Hannah's mother-in-law began visiting more often to babysit her grandson. Annette looked down on her daughter-in-law. She liked it when Hannah obeyed her unconditionally. From her first visits, she began to establish her own order in her son's house. Hannah disliked her mother-in-law, knowing that after the death of her first husband, Roger's father, the woman was focused solely on her personal life, practically ignoring her son. She had no luck in her personal life. Until she met her current husband. Hannah, having become a mum, promised herself that Luke would always be her priority, no matter what happened in their lives. And then grief came to her house again. It was Luke's 4th birthday. Hannah remembered that day vividly. It was a beautiful spring day. She finished cooking dinner, took her son by the hand and left the house. They walked along the country road, looking for Roger coming home. But instead of her husband, Pavel, a colleague of her husband, was walking toward her. "Hannah, hello," he began, and for some reason the woman turned cold when she saw the man's eyes. "Let's go inside. I have something to say." "What's the matter with Roger? What happened?" Hannah squeezed her son's hand so much that the boy shrieked in surprise. "Hannah, I'm sorry. The paramedic came, but it was too late. They were changing the wiring. Something shorted out and Roger—" "Can you hear me? Hannah, are you okay?" She heard his voice as if from afar, settling on the dusty country road. "Roger's gone? How will I live without him?" flashed through her mind before she fainted. In the morning, her mother-in-law arrived. Glaring angrily at her daughter-in-law, the woman hissed at Anna's quiet greeting. "It's all because of you." But why do you say this?" "Because he worked days and nights," Annette continued. "He never saw the light of day. Everything to pamper you, and you just sat at home. If it weren't for you, my son would still be alive." Hannah said nothing then, listened silently and went to her son. Sometimes she herself thought she was to blame for her husband's death. So Hannah was left alone in the world, without a husband, without a mother. Only her son was growing up. Luke, her light, her joy. 8 years had passed since his death. Luke had grown up, but he was acting out a lot, growing up without his father's supervision, not obeying his mother at all, and Hannah couldn't scold her son. How could she scold him when she wanted to hug him and stroke his head? Having washed her face, the woman entered her son's room. "Get up, Luke," Hannah said, opening the curtains. The boy was asleep. On the floor lay a flashlight, and on the pillow a book, Robinson Crusoe. "Luke, you'll be late for school." "Okay, Mum. Just one more minute." "Did you read all night again?" "Not all night. Just half." Luke got out of bed and started warming up, squatting and waving his arms. Hannah smiled and went to make breakfast. When did he grow up so fast? It seemed like just yesterday he was a baby, and now he's into pirates and astronauts. He's making planes out of cardboard. He'll bring home a bride soon enough. Hannah turned on the stove, put the coffee on and poured 4 eggs into a frying pan. Today she had a free day, a day off, even though it was Wednesday. She could clean up, do laundry and cook something tasty. By evening, Bill promised to come by. Will he? He's a master at talking, but he doesn't always get to the point. Hannah poured herself some coffee, sat down across from her son and watched him eat. Luke was devouring his scrambled eggs with gusto. After breakfast, he stood up, kissed his mother on the cheek and went off to school. Hannah went to the window to see him off. An inexplicable longing tugged at her heart. What if one day he packs up and leaves? Not to school, but to another life as an adult. And she'll be all alone. Bill? Why did she get involved with him? Bill was known as the local Don Juan, always with one woman or another. As soon as he divorced his wife, he started going out. His ex-wife had long since found someone else, and Bill was left alone and started visiting Hannah, first just to talk, then for something more serious. Hannah knew perfectly well that Bill wasn't her match, and she had no plans to marry him. He was only good for passing the time. She couldn't rely on him for anything. But he did know how to give compliments, which was nice. Sometimes Hannah even thought she might be in love with him. Today Bill said he'd drop by in the afternoon. Who knows, maybe he'll come. Hannah leisurely tidied up the house and sat down with a book in her favourite chair. After a moment of thought, she set the novel aside and went to the dresser where she kept her linens. Opening a drawer, she pulled out a cherished bottle of perfume, applying a drop to her neck. A bit of feminine joy. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. "Bill, you're here. I'm glad to see you," the woman said, opening the door. The man looked at her with a self-confident smile. "Were you waiting?" "What does it matter, since you're already here?" Bill kicked off his boots, went into the living room and sat on the couch. "You're a beautiful woman, Hannah. Do you think maybe we should get married after all?" Hannah looked at Bill, unsure if he was joking or serious. "I remember you got married once already. Wasn't that enough?" "It was enough," Bill laughed and pulled Hannah to him. When Bill left, Hannah realised, Luke will be home from school soon, and I haven't even made dinner. She peeled potatoes, put them on the stove and fried meatballs. Bill's visit, as always, left her with mixed feelings. Did Hannah think they should still be a family? Of course, she did. It was hard for her without a man, and Luke needed a father. But Bill was so unreliable, so careless, and that stopped Hannah most of all. And then a few days later, Hannah found out that Bill had started visiting Daria, who lived next door. To her surprise, she was both upset and relieved. On the one hand, she was offended that she had been so easily exchanged for another woman. But on the other hand, Hannah felt a strange freedom, as if deep down she had been burdened by this strange relationship. In any case, she began to treat Bill like an ordinary acquaintance. She could drink tea with him, talk about this and that, but she would not let him do more. And Bill put on a mask of surprise and incomprehension of her coldness and alienation. One Saturday morning, Hannah decided to go to the city. It was time to visit her mother-in-law. She tried to keep in touch with her, at least for her son's sake. So she sometimes brought pickles and jams she made herself. She always stayed only a short time and returned to her son. After loading the jars of pickles and jam into her bag, Hannah wandered to the bus stop. Suddenly a car pulled up near the bus stop and the door opened. "Are you waiting for the bus?" the driver asked. Hannah squinted at the man. He was pale, grey as a faded sweater, bald, with glasses and a skinny face. "Yes, I am," she nodded. "Why?" "Oh, just, the bus ain't coming." The man waved his hands. "There was an accident. I was just driving by, so you don't need to wait." Hannah sighed. Probably I should give up on the trip, she thought. "And you're going into town?" the man asked, looking at Hannah. "I can give you a ride." The temptation to drive to the city was stronger than her fear of the driver, and Hannah nodded. "Let's go, if it's on your way." Picking up her bag, she settled into the back seat. The car started up. The driver suddenly introduced himself. "My name is Patrick. And you?" Hannah shuddered. "I'm Hannah." She became embarrassed under Patrick's attentive gaze, her cheeks flushing. The conversation flowed smoothly into her visit with her mother-in-law. The man shook his head. "Why didn't your husband help you carry the bags?" "He couldn't," Hannah lied, blushing again. Patrick turned out to be a pleasant man. He worked as a cook in a restaurant and talked about his work and hobbies. The woman found herself liking Patrick, hanging on his every word. And what a pleasant voice he has. I could listen forever, she thought. Here we are. The car stopped in front of her mother-in-law's house. "Thank you. How much do I owe you?" the woman asked. "Don't insult me. It's a sin not to give a ride to a beautiful lady." Hannah felt embarrassed again, but there was no arguing. Patrick firmly refused to take the money, and they parted ways. After wishing her a good day, Patrick got into the car and drove away. Annette's apartment was spotlessly clean. The woman looked at Hannah with disdain and reluctantly invited her in. "Come in, I'll pour tea," the mother-in-law said as she walked. The conversation was short and practically meaningless. What did Hannah expect? Annette had never been warm towards her. She was probably still accusing her. Well, at least she adored Luke. After brief meeting, saying goodbye, Annette slipped Hannah some money for a present for Luke. "Let him visit during the holidays. I'm always glad to see him." For the first time, Annette smiled, and it suited her well. "Of course he will." Hannah nodded and left the apartment. The weather was wonderful. Deciding to take a walk, she strolled past storefronts and street cafes. Suddenly, she saw a brightly coloured sign for a hair salon. Why not? She thought. Today, Hannah especially wanted a change. Perhaps a fashionable haircut or hair dye. Her thoughts drifted back to Patrick, his warm gaze and charming smile. The young hairdresser took a long look at her, examining her curls. "Are you sure you've decided to cut it so drastically?" "Yes, cut my hair into something shorter. I've had long hair all my life and I want a change." Hannah nodded decisively. The girl took the scissors and began her magic on Hannah's hair. Hannah closed her eyes, almost dozing off, until she heard, "Done! Take a look." At first, Hannah didn't recognize herself. The mirror reflected a woman unfamiliar to her. Her cheeks were framed by long strands, and the back of her head was nearly bare. But what a transformation was achieved. "Don't you regret the length?" asked the hairdresser. "No, I don't." Hannah shook her head and smiled. "You're just magic." When Hannah got home, she went about her usual tasks, cooking dinner, tidying up. In the evening, Bill dropped by. Seeing her new haircut, he whistled, "Oh, wow! You look urban now. In love, or what?" "Maybe you're right, and I'm in love," Hannah muttered. "What do you care? It's like you got the wrong door. Yours is down the street." "Come on, Hannah, chill out. Will you invite me in?" "No, Bill. Go back where you came from. I'm tired." "Well, as you like, I won't insist." He turned and headed for the gate, while Hannah sat on the porch gazing into the starry sky. On the weekend, Claire and Brianna visited her. Brianna brought her daughter. Luke, taking the girl under his wing, showed her his books with bright pictures, and then took her for a walk in the settlement. The women sat on a bench under an old apple tree. "How nice it is here, Hannah. I should move to the village. I'm tired of the city's constant hustle," Claire said. "And now confess. You're in love, right?" "With whom?" Hannah laughed and suddenly blushed deeply. "I know you never liked Bill, so you can both relax. Now he's dating my neighbour. It's over between us." "You, dear, are not fooling anyone. Eyes sparkling, new haircut, looking 10 years younger." Hannah couldn't hide from her friends' discerning gazes and had to tell them about Patrick. "I don't think we'll see him again. He gave me a ride and forgot." Hannah waved her hand dismissively. "I once read that to make a wish come true, you need to repeat the same phrase to yourself. For example, 'I met a good man.' Then your subconscious mind will tune in and it will come true," Brianna suggested. Hannah thought, "I would like to see him again," and shuddered. A car pulled up to the house and a door slammed. The friends exchanged glances. "Are you expecting someone?" "No," Hannah shrugged, but to her shock, Patrick was standing at her gate. The woman was surprised. How did he know her address? A smile played on his face and she suddenly felt warm and cosy. "I'm sorry, Hannah, for dropping without invitation." "Come in, since you're here," she nodded. Claire and Brianna scrutinized the guest, glancing at each other. Hannah felt inexplicably uneasy. "Why not have tea with us?" Claire smiled. "Why not have tea with us?" Claire smiled. "Try Hannah's pies. She's a master at them." To Hannah's surprise, Patrick quickly blended in, meeting Luke, joking with her friends. sharing stories about his work and even offering a couple of recipes. In the evening, when Claire and Brianna were leaving, he offered to drive them, but they declined. Claire had her car. Hannah was alone with Patrick, except for Luke, who remembered he hadn't done his math and settled on the couch with his textbook. Hannah was torn by conflicting feelings. On the one hand, she felt like she should hint to Patrick it was time to leave, but on the other, she didn't want him to go. "Oh, I forgot to say why I came." Patrick slapped his forehead. "I'm getting old. Memory's failing. I found this in the car the next day." He took a tube of lipstick from his pocket. "Here, you dropped it in my car." "Mum, I can't do the task," Luke suddenly said. "Let me see." Patrick took the textbook from the boy. Hannah watched the two heads bent over the textbook with a kind of pinched longing. It was Roger who should have been in Patrick's place. When the task was over, Hannah suddenly said, "Luke, go to your room. And Patrick, it's already late. I'll see you out." The boy collected his books and left. Patrick looked anxiously at Hannah. Have I offended you in any way? Have I embarrassed you?" "No. Well, it's just that it's really time for us to go to bed. I'm sorry, and thank you so much again." "Okay, but please forgive me if I've done anything wrong." Hannah nodded and walked her guest to the gate. "I just want to say one more time." Patrick hesitated, looking at Hannah, then at the apple tree growing near the gate. "I'm sorry. I really don't know why I came here. I just liked you very much. You're a really stunning woman." "Beautiful?" Hannah interrupted him. "You just came because you liked me. And why are you all like that?" "Like what?" Patrick asked in surprise. "And then what? You'll come here on weekends, right? Or when Luke won't be home? Just to have a good time with a beautiful woman. But there's no one to fix a fence or an outlet. You know? No one. Just words. Beautiful woman. Take my advice. Look for another beautiful woman and drink tea with her." Hannah abruptly turned around and slammed the gate as hard as she could. Tears came to her eyes, and she wanted to howl with hopelessness. "And how many more of these will be in my life? Bill, now this Patrick has fallen on my head. They need to relax, have a good time. And why not? They see that I am a lonely woman. They think that I hope for something, so they go to me. When will it end? And that stupid haircut." The woman went into the kitchen and sat down at the table, clutching her temples with her fingers. Thus she sat, almost till midnight, motionless, hunched, thinking of her unhappy fate. Maybe I had too much happiness with Roger, so God decided that I had had enough and didn't need to hope. Nobody needs me, only Luke, and therefore for his sake I must live. The woman fell asleep only in the morning. The whole next week passed as usual. Work, home, conversations with her son. Bill visited Hannah twice, and both times she sent him away from the gate. He promised that he would certainly fix the outlet and the fence, and even the roof. But she didn't want to talk to him. Let him go to his girlfriend and make empty promises that he has no intention of keeping. Sunday morning the woman woke up early. She decided that today she would devote the day to rest. Of course, it would be possible to clean the house or wash the laundry accumulated during the week, but their work week was not easy, and Hannah wanted to sit in her favourite chair with a book, to talk to her son about this and that. Hannah lay in bed for a long time, then slowly got up and woke Luke. Together they cooked pancakes for breakfast, and the woman suddenly realised that she felt happy. How good is it when you are in no hurry, just to be next to your son, and not think about anyone? "Mum, there's a car outside." Luke looked up from the pancakes and peered out the window. "Is it coming towards us?" Hannah glanced in surprise at the car pulling up to the fence. "Patrick, what does he want? I made it clear I didn't want to see him any more." The man got out of the car, Hannah frowned. She had been looking forward to spending the day with her son without any strangers. Meanwhile, Patrick took a black tool case from the trunk and timidly knocked on the gate. Then he shifted his gaze to the kitchen window and smiled. "I'll open the gate for him, Mum." Without waiting for a reply, Luke ran to open the door for the uninvited guest. "Hannah, hello." Patrick cautiously peeked into the kitchen, as if afraid she'd throw cookware at him. But Hannah shrugged indifferently. "Good morning. Did I forget something of mine in your car again?" "No, nothing," Patrick smiled. "You mentioned a broken outlet. I'm here to fix it, unless someone else has already done it." The woman looked at Patrick in surprise. "You look beautiful," he added. She glanced at her outfit. A robe stained with flour, a laundered apron. Yes, definitely I looked great, she thought to herself. "So where's the broken outlet?" Patrick asked, looking around the kitchen. Hannah nodded. "Then I'll turn off the electricity and get started, if you don't mind." "You don't mind, do you?" Hannah shook her head, still unable to speak. And Patrick did fix all the outlets in her house, checking the wiring and replacing the light bulb in the basement. Looking at all his efforts, Hannah felt obliged to ask him to stay for lunch. Patrick was reluctant, but Luke insisted he join them for a modest meal of simple pasta. Patrick gallantly praised Hannah's culinary talents. "You're a cook, aren't you? Compared to you, my cooking is just childish babble," she joked. "Oh, really? You're a talent, making delicious dishes from simple ingredients. For some reason, everyone thinks there's some kind of haute cuisine. But food is food. It's all about whether it tastes good or not." The man was going to leave after lunch, but Hannah, surprised by her own words, invited him to join her and Luke for a walk in the forest. Patrick agreed. Hannah was surprised to catch herself thinking she enjoyed talking to him. He didn't hint at anything, as Bill did. Conversed with her and Luke, clearly enjoying their time together. Patrick left around 9 o'clock in the evening, when Hannah was already nodding off and Luke was desperately yawning. "I'm always lingering at your place. It's just unseemly to behave like this." Patrick smiled guiltily. "But it's so nice here. I lose track of time." "Come again." Hannah smiled sincerely. "We'd love to see you." "But I fixed all the sockets, so there's no more reason," Patrick said seriously, with a slight smile on his face. "And I'll break some of them. You can fix it again," the boys suggested. "You don't have to break anything," Hannah said sternly to her son, though her lips spread into a smile. "Come on, we'll be glad to see you." The man began to visit every Saturday. He brought Luke intricate construction sets, shared adventure novels from his library, taught Hannah how to cook a few Italian dishes, and fixed her washing machine. The woman had grown accustomed to Patrick's visits, but she couldn't understand why he came so often. He never outwardly expressed any affection or tried to hug or kiss her. He acted more like a friend or even a brother. Only once, when she walked him to his car, did he suddenly embrace her, holding her tightly before releasing her and looking guiltily at his feet. "Hannah, I'm sorry. I hope I didn't scare you." "You didn't? Not one bit." She placed both hands on Patrick's shoulders, kissed his cheek, then quickly brushed her lips against his. The man smiled. "It's a good thing that I didn't scare you. I will come next week. Just wait for me." And Hannah eagerly anticipated Patrick's next visit. She felt something unusual might happen, something that would change her life. Perhaps these changes would finally be for the better, but her expectations were not met. On Saturday morning there was a knock at the door, but it wasn't Patrick. It was Bill. He looked at her mockingly, then spat on the ground. "Thought I wouldn't find out, huh?" he hissed. "Find out what?" Hannah asked. She felt uneasy. It seemed that Bill had been drinking all night and was now in a foul mood. "Why is some city guy visiting you? Why did you leave me? Huh?" What are you talking about? Hannah tried to keep her voice emotionless, but she couldn't hide her excitement. Everyone says he comes here every Saturday. You're not shy to be with him in front of your son, are you? He stepped toward Hannah and she backed away. Go home and sleep it off, she said. Come here. I'll prove I'm worth 10 men like him. Bill hissed and tried to grab Hannah, but she dodged. Go home, Betta, she whispered. What do you want from me? I may love you, but you treat me like this. Hannah noticed with amazement the tears of drunkenness glistening on Bill's cheeks. Come here, I said. He grabbed her arm and yanked her toward him, and she barely kept her footing. Well, do you love... Well, who do you love more, me or him? Bill attempted to kiss her. What's going on here? The man turned around abruptly to find Patrick standing in the doorway. Hannah, who is this? An acquaintance, she replied briefly, and he's just leaving. Who said I was leaving? Bill released Hannah and stepped toward Patrick. I'm staying. It's you. You're leaving. Hey, quit going to my woman. You haven't been beaten up for a long time, have you? Hannah's throat went dry. She realized Bill would likely try to fight Patrick. Shall we step outside for the beginning? Patrick suggested calmly. Or are we settling things right here? Sure, let's go out. Bill grinned unkindly. Look, Hannah, there won't be a wet spot left for your friend. You'll learn how dangerous. Bill didn't finish. Patrick moved swiftly, smoothly sliding forward to intercept his hand, and lightly pushed. Bill lost his balance and tumbled out the door like a sack of potatoes. Patrick watched tensely as Bill squatted and tried to get up, unable to, whether from the fall or the alcohol in his blood. Still want to talk? Patrick asked calmly. Or should I wait until you sober up? Damn you, Bill swore. Fine, I won't kill you in front of a woman, but you wait. And you, Hannah, wait too. I'll come back. Bill awkwardly rose and wandered to the gate. Once outside the fence, he kicked the wheel of Patrick's car and walked away. Hannah saw him off with a startled look. Who was that? Patrick asked. Is he really your boyfriend? No, he's not, she sighed sadly. He's my mistake. I got involved with him and now he's decided I belong to him for life. But wait, Patrick, how did you handle it so skillfully? He's bigger, stronger. He's drunk, Patrick shrugged. And I served in the army. Learned some things there. Plus, I practiced karate. Skill is more important than strength. Thank you. You came just in time. I couldn't have handled him. Patrick suddenly squeezed Hannah's hands and spoke quietly. Take care of yourself. I can't always be nearby. Why? Hannah looked intently into his eyes. You can't, or you don't want to? I want to. I really do. But you said you don't need it. I'm willing to wait. Wait as long as it takes until you change your mind. I've already changed my mind. Patrick proposed 6 months later, and Hannah agreed. There were a few guests at the wedding, Claire, Brianna, Luke, and a few of Patrick's colleagues. When Patrick invited Hannah to dance for the first time as husband and wife, she felt as if her feet were about to lift off the floor, and she would soar, like in the picture embedded in her memory. Why did you choose me? She asked quietly. Because that day at the bus stop, I saw the most beautiful woman in the world. Patrick replied succinctly. Hannah suddenly thought that Roger was now pleased for her and their son. Wherever he was, he would never deny her the right to happiness. Stephanie Para? A grey-haired man in his 50s asked. The girl nodded. She had short, thick black hair. Stephanie looked like a schoolgirl, but according to her documents she was already 27. Very skinny, almost boyish, dressed in spacious baggy clothes, with a look of impertinence. However, in Mr. Larson's office, she behaved modestly, hiding her eyes and keeping her hands behind her back.
So, you want to get a job with us as a cleaner, Stephanie?
The deputy chief asked. She nodded again.
Any criminal record?
Stephanie shrugged her shoulders. She was confused, and that was the most eloquent answer for him. He understood immediately.
Our security service will find out anyway. Tell it like it is.
There is a minor criminal record. I'm out on parole. I really need this job. Mr. Larson shook his head. At that moment, the door behind him opened, and a stately man with greying temples entered the office. He was broad-shouldered, handsome, with a perfectly even, swarthy skin tone.
Mr. Larson, have you finally brought your daughter to meet us?
The man asked.
No, Mr. Nathanson. No, this is a candidate for our job. Are we looking for someone now?
Frank Nathanson was the director of this company. He always gave the impression of a man of integrity and good-naturedness. In fact, that's precisely what he was.
We're looking for a cleaner, remember?
Oh, yes.
Well, then you're hired.
Will you show the girl where her workplace is? Mr. Nathanson asked.
Wait a minute. What about the criminal record? We haven't had such a practice yet.
Mr. Larson obviously didn't want to hire her. Stephanie looked at the director, who had just walked through the door, with her wide blue eyes, a pitiful expression on her face.
No such practice? What are you talking about? You've served 15 days yourself,
laughed the supervisor. The deputy blushed and coughed.
Well, it was far from a felony. You're accepted, Stephanie,
smiled Frank Nathanson. The woman gave him her radiant smile, and the deputy, gritting his teeth, handed her the employment application form. Then he dryly introduced her to the staff. When Stephanie began her work duties, she didn't hear Mr. Larson telling his colleagues that the new girl came to them from prison. They began to whisper at once, and Stephanie realized that her little secret was no longer a secret to anyone. She entered the room, washed the floor, and when she left, the women hurriedly checked their pockets and bags, as if she could have grabbed something at any time. They didn't talk to Stephanie. Only one young and rather pretty female employee asked questions. Is she married? Where does she live? How much does she earn? She'd pry, but Stephanie wasn't used to that. She was lost. What to answer? Yes, she had been married, but not any more. Stephanie grew up in an ordinary town. There was a little girl next door to her. Her name was Meredith, and they became friends. From early childhood, Stephanie shared everything with her. Toys, dreams, experiences. Meredith was an example for her in many ways. She was braver, could stand up for both of them if they were offended. In the school where the girls became classmates, all sorts of things happened. When it came to fighting, Meredith always stood up for her friend. She was always stronger in her studies. She had a great memory and was better at memorizing everything. The only thing Stephanie was better at than her friend was sports. Stephanie found solace in running. She got so into it that she started winning competitions. It was at one of these that she met Kyle. He was a young and handsome graduate. They experienced what they called love at first sight. They exchanged numbers at the next competition and began to communicate. Then Kyle began to visit Stephanie, and they went out in the evenings. He gave her flowers and looked at her in such a way that his gaze was more eloquent than any declaration of love. He was tender, caring, and she fell in love with him, dissolving without a trace. Meredith envied her friend for the first time in her life. Boys were looking at her too, but no one was doing for her what Kyle was doing for Stephanie. "Introduce us," she asked. She really wanted to see what kind of guy he was, and why her friend was so smitten. "Okay, he'll be here today. Come by 9, too." Meredith came and saw a tall, dark-haired young man hugging her best friend. Jealousy flared up in her. Stephanie had only spent time with her before, and now Meredith had already forgotten when they last went out together. When Kyle turned around, Meredith was pierced by another feeling. Goosebumps ran along her skin. It was envy, with a dash of crush. "Hi, Meredith. Stephanie's been telling me a lot about you. I finally get to meet you." Kyle smiled at her, and Meredith also fell for him, just like her friend. They were carried away by the same current. The next year, Stephanie, Meredith, and Kyle were inseparable. Meredith always felt like the third wheel. Kyle even introduced her to his friend, but Meredith was too much in love with Kyle. Nothing worked out and they broke up. After graduating from school, Meredith decided to enroll in economics, and Stephanie just followed her friend, as she used to do before. "I've been doing pretty well in maths lately. Do you think I can get in?" Stephanie asked. She had really become passionate about algebra in the last year. Meredith was better in class in all subjects, while Stephanie was never embarrassed by her modest grades. But in maths she always passed with an A. Meredith was used to being better than her friend in everything, and such trifles hurt her. But it hurt even more that Kyle was with her friend. Both of them enrolled in economics, and to Meredith's shock, Stephanie became the best student in the course. Meredith was consumed by envy. Relations with her friend became strained, and they distanced themselves from each other for some time. As for Kyle, his father arranged for him to study at the Faculty of Business and Technology, although he dreamed of sports. He was in such good physical shape that he could be on the cover of a magazine. He and Stephanie grew closer, and one day Meredith learned that the couple had begun living together. Kyle rented a small apartment, and Stephanie moved in with him. Kyle's parents took it seriously. They had raised their son very traditionally and conservative, so the fact that he and Stephanie moved in together was a shock to them. Upon learning that their son was living with a girl, they forced him to arrange a meeting, which turned into matchmaking. Besides, Stephanie's parents were against their daughter becoming a bride at such age, but the girl begged them to let her be his bride. "I love him anyway. I want to be with him," she said. Eventually, passions subsided, and the couple got engaged. Stephanie seemed to blossom at that time. Her studies were going great. She was engaged. She had not abandoned running and was always in great shape. Meredith, on the contrary, began to lag behind her on all fronts. She started drinking and dating one guy after another. She was almost expelled twice for truancy and rudeness. Stephanie was looking to meet with her, but Meredith seemed to shut her out, not answering the phone. Closer to the third year, Stephanie began to appear in loose clothes. Meredith didn't understand why her friend changed her style. When the belly became noticeable, she guessed what had happened. "Are you pregnant?" Meredith asked. They hadn't spoken in months. Meredith had ignored her, nodding dryly when they met in the hallway, and now she approached on her own. "Yes," Stephanie said with a shy smile. Meredith looked at her friend's hand, where there was a ring. "Have you married?" "No, but we're engaged. We're getting married soon." Meredith cried. Stephanie thought that her friend was happy for her, but they were tears of pain, jealousy, and resentment. Meredith had done everything to forget Kyle, not to destroy his relationship with Stephanie, not to do bad things. But her feelings were stronger. No other guy had ever made her forget Kyle, and even alcohol didn't have the desired effect. "I'm so happy for you," Meredith said finally and hugged her friend. Stephanie saw it as a sign that they were getting closer again. She made Meredith her maid of honor at the wedding. It was a big celebration. Meredith got drunk and secretly confessed her love to Kyle. Stephanie didn't hear it. After the ceremony in an expensive restaurant, she took Kyle aside and said, "You don't know, but I've loved you for a long time. I fell in love as soon as I saw you, and I'm going crazy. I printed out your photo, and carry it with me always now." Kyle was shocked.
"Do you realize you're saying this to me at my wedding?"
"I should have done it earlier, right?"
"Come to your senses," he said, leaving Meredith alone.
The next day she called him and asked for a meeting. Kyle came. He thought she would want to apologize.
"Do you even remember what you told me yesterday?" he asked.
Meredith nodded. "I remember it well, and I didn't lie. You may not share my feelings, but it's always nice to know you're loved. I can't help it. Just know that you'll always have me, and I'll never stop loving you." Phew, I admitted it. I'm relieved. Meredith got up and walked away, leaving Kyle alone to digest what he had heard. He stared after her for a long time. Of course, nothing had changed for Kyle with Stephanie. He continued to love her. She had become his wife. But now, when Meredith came to visit them, sparks flared as soon as their gazes crossed. Kyle and Stephanie had a son, Tommy. Stephanie immersed herself fully in motherhood, while Kyle began to establish his own business. Contrary to his father's wishes, he remained true to his passion for sports. Instead of opening a retail outlet as his father had envisioned, Kyle invested in premises to set up a gym with a boxing ring. The facility also included a bar for spectators who preferred watching rather than participating in sports. The venue quickly became popular, attracting people from other cities. With his success, Kyle bought a large house for his wife and son. As Tommy grew up, he too developed an interest in sports. By the time he started school, Stephanie and Kyle's relationship had cooled. The initial passion had faded, and time had eroded their connection. They now argued over trivial matters. Stephanie was no longer the cheerful girl she once was, consumed by her own affairs. Stephanie graduated later than her friend Meredith, due to her maternity leave. She discovered a talent for record-keeping and became an excellent economist. A successful company offered her a substantial salary to prevent her from joining a competitor. Kyle, however, insisted that she work with him, managing his paperwork. Stephanie didn't tell him, but she craved independence. Living and working together constantly, she longed for a change of environment and interaction with different people at work. This was her primary reason for staying with another company. There were no inappropriate relationships there, just interesting cases, significant deals, and a sense of importance. She felt valued and could realize her potential as a specialist. Stephanie needed some distance from Kyle, as their relationship was already strained with frequent quarrels. Meredith also matured and married a man who was deeply in love with her. Kyle and Stephanie attended their wedding, a modest celebration in an ordinary cafe. Meredith wanted to cry when she looked at Kyle and he at her. Both realized that their feelings for each other hadn't disappeared at all. Initially, Kyle showed no interest in Meredith. This remained true for the first years of his marriage. However, when Tommy started school, everything changed. Meredith continued to visit Stephanie a couple of times a month, and Kyle began to view her differently. One evening, while drinking wine at Kyle's mansion, Meredith's husband became intoxicated and fell asleep on the sofa. Kyle turned to Meredith and asked, "Tell me, is what you said back then still true? Have you managed to forget me?" Stephanie was busy in the kitchen at this moment. Meredith looked up at Kyle and replied, "It'll always be like this. I told you, I'm loyal as a dog." Unfortunately, her loyalty didn't extend to female friendship. Her feelings for Kyle were stronger. Kyle kissed her in his own house, marking a point of no return. A few days later, Stephanie called Meredith and said that her husband was wondering if she wanted to work in his office on documents. At the time, Meredith was working as a manager in a cell phone store, unable to find work in her field. Unlike Stephanie, she wasn't a skilled economist, so she gladly accepted Kyle's offer, knowing there was more than just a job opportunity behind it. Meredith and Kyle began a clandestine relationship that lasted 6 months. During this time, Meredith made several serious errors in documentation. Stephanie, while reviewing the papers for Kyle's sports complex, noticed these mistakes. She covered for her friend and helped rectify the errors. The situation came to a head on New Year's Eve. Kyle was purchasing new equipment, and Meredith saw an opportunity to profit by buying cheaper, undocumented items. She made the deal behind Kyle's back, but was afraid to sign off on it. Feigning illness, she asked Stephanie to come to the office and sign. And to distract her from scrutinizing the documents, Meredith sent her a photo of Kyle lying in bed with her through a fake person. The image only showed part of an arm, making it impossible to identify the woman. Meredith's ploy worked. Stephanie was devastated and signed everything without checking. Then she called her best friend in tears, exclaiming, "Kyle is cheating on me!" Thus, Meredith pocketed a substantial sum of money. However, problems arose from the deal, not just with tax authorities. The substandard equipment caused an injury, and the case went to court. Stephanie received a prison sentence because the injured party was the son of an influential official. Knowing Stephanie, Kyle couldn't believe she was responsible for choosing the equipment, while Meredith insisted it was all her doing. "How could you do this to me? You're like a sister to me," Stephanie shouted. Meredith retorted with angelic innocence. "I know you're facing a terrible situation, but that's no reason to act despicably, Stephanie. You can't blame me for what you did yourself. You're listed as the chief accountant, while I just handle papers. If you'd listened to your husband and left your work for his business, maybe you wouldn't have made this mistake. Or did you do it intentionally? Was it really for the money?" Stephanie lunged at Meredith, but Kyle separated them, siding with Meredith. She had been influencing him for a long time and immediately claimed that Stephanie was interested in the equipment purchase. Kyle now had no doubt that his wife was to blame. The trial was lost and Stephanie was sentenced to prison. Meredith visited her there. "Why did you come? You've left my son motherless, disgraced me and ruined my life. Why are you doing this to me?" Stephanie asked. "Why should you have everything? Maybe I want to be happy too. All methods are fair in love." Meredith showed Stephanie her phone with more pictures. Stephanie finally recognized who was in the photos with her husband. Furious and hysterical, she called Kyle, screaming and swearing. "Your mistress set me up. Don't you see?" "I'm sorry, Stephanie, but it has nothing to do with that. I'm just a man. We're naturally polygamous. But I found where the money went. It's in your account, so you can stop lying about it being Meredith's fault." Yes, Meredith had taken care of it. She had initially wanted to embezzle a tidy sum, but realized she would gain more by simply framing Stephanie. Soon after the trial, Kyle terminated her parental rights and divorced her. A few months later, he married Meredith. Stephanie learned about it from her parents. They tried to defend their daughter's rights, but to little avail. However, they saw their grandson Tommy regularly and reminded him of his mum. At first, Kyle opposed their visits, but his parents admonished him. "If we were deprived of seeing our grandson, we would go crazy. Your wife made a mistake and she's paying for it, but you can't take Tommy's grandparents away from him. No, son, it's a bad idea," his mother told him. Kyle was receptive to her advice. Over time, he even became curious about Stephanie. He asked about her from his ex-mother-in-law, who replied that her daughter was doing fine and should soon be released for good behavior. Meanwhile, Stephanie was learning to survive. There were moments when she suffered severely. She didn't retaliate against the aggression of other prisoners. Not everyone there was an innocent victim. Many women were there for valid reasons. Some had anger issues. Others wanted to hurt, humiliate and harm. that kind of temperament. Stephanie endured it because she had a purpose. She desperately wanted to get out and reclaim her son. "Why don't you answer these scumbags? Answer them in their way. Hit them," said those who were on her side. Stephanie was rising from the floor, her lip bloody. "No," she said quietly. "None of them are worth my spending an extra day without my son." She was studying legal intricacies, wondering what rights she had. Kyle's family was wealthy, but she was left with nothing, and fighting them was clearly challenging.
"I'll give you some advice,"
said the lawyer. Stephanie's parents had paid to consult her. "Yes, I'll do whatever it takes. I'm willing to do the impossible, but I'll get my son back."
"First, you'll have to get out on parole. That will show you've behaved well and that you're not a danger to society, that you've learned your lesson. Second, you'll have to find a job quickly, any job, Stephanie. Work 4 months and then sue to have your parental rights restored. During that time, it's a good idea to volunteer. Judges will appreciate that. Also, you must have no misdemeanors. Even cross the road properly during those months. At first, your rights may be partially restored, and I'm pretty sure they will be. Your husband's family is powerful, so they may try to keep you from seeing your son, but in this country the law usually favours the mother. Even mothers with problems get their rights back if they recover. You don't have that problem. You see, you have an advantage. In fact, the hardest part is happening right now. You're away from your child. A lawyer must not only know the law, but also be a good psychologist. Luckily, that's precisely what Stephanie got. "You're right. I don't even have time to cry. It's hard here, but even when I'm mocked here, the pain of separation from my son is stronger," she said, and started crying in front of the lawyer. He sympathized with her, having seen worse in his practice. After that, Stephanie decided she would live each day striving for the future. She began to exercise to keep herself in great shape, realizing that one day she would face the judge, who would see not a woman with faded eyes, but someone strong and unbroken. And finally, the day came when Stephanie was able to fulfill the first part of the plan and get out of prison on parole. Now, when she got a job in, she began to work diligently, despite the sidelong glances. At first, everyone treated her with distrust because of her prison past, but one day, a colleague stayed late at work doing a report. Stephanie had finished cleaning the floor and was about to leave. "Oh, I'll never finish this," exclaimed young Emma. "Hard work? Deadline?" inquired Stephanie. "These reports, I need a formula and it won't insert. I don't know how to work in this program. Why didn't I become a chef, as my mother advised?" Stephanie walked over to her. It's a little more complicated here. You have to copy the blank lines, but not like you did. Don't highlight the first column. Look, I'll show you." Stephanie took the mouse from Emma's hands and carefully copied the required data, then with a deft click pasted it. The formula appeared. "Wow, you're a genius. How do you know that?" "My first field is in economy. I worked in it for a long time." Emma was new to the team and had no prejudice towards Stephanie, though she had certainly heard about the criminal record. "And now they won't take you back to that place again, will they?" Stephanie shook her head sadly. "I doubt it. It might be worth a try, though. My supervisor was reasonable. I don't know why I thought my ceiling now was to be a cleaner. Anyway, it's no big deal. Let me help you to end it quickly." Stephanie sat down at the table and quickly completed Emma's tasks. They were so engrossed in their work that they didn't notice Mr. Nathanson appeared behind them. "Well, well, what's this, Emma? I suppose you'll be helping Stephanie mop the floor next," he said with a smile. "If I have to, I'll do it," Emma replied, looking embarrassed. Stephanie shook her head. "What? No, that's nonsense. I just wanted to help, and we're already finished." Frank sat down and looked at Stephanie. "What did you say your education was?" "I'm an economist, but since I went to jail for someone else's misdeeds, hardly anyone cares," Stephanie said bitterly, walking past the boss with her mop. Emma's work was almost done. "I'm sorry, I was struggling with the formula. The program is new and she gave me a hint. She's excellent at it. I don't think there's anyone here who can work these spreadsheets as skillfully. I've only seen such skill from a university professor." Frank Nathanson nodded and left. That evening, as Stephanie was returning to her parents' house, he leafed through her file. He made inquiries and quickly received all the information: her jail time, education, and work history. Frank studied her biography with raised eyebrows. "Well, we've never had such cleaners before, and I doubt we will again," he sighed, thinking he should give the girl a chance. Since she claimed to have been jailed for someone else's crimes, she would likely be careful now. And specialists with her level of expertise were difficult to come by. Frank had an economics degree himself and constantly had to double-check his staff's reports. It would be ideal if he could focus on solving current problems and making decisions while relying on someone else for such tasks. Mr. Larson was a good specialist, of course, but he was old school. He excelled as a partner and always gave important legal advice, but he wasn't strong in economics or computer programs. With these thoughts, Frank got into his car and drove to his lonely bachelor apartment. It was dark and quiet as usual. "Should I get a cat?" he muttered to himself. On the wall hung a portrait of an incredibly beautiful blonde. He missed her, but not as much as he used to. Several weeks passed. Frank was preparing for an important deal, having completely forgotten about his intention to talk to Stephanie. Mr. Larson, his deputy and assistant, insisted that the deal would take the company to a new level. But there was another reason. If the deal didn't pan out, they would be in serious trouble. Frank consulted another specialist, who, after a quick assessment of the contract terms, concluded it was a risky 50-50. "Well, who dares wins," Mr. Larson said. "And by the way, if you miss this opportunity, you'll be kicking yourself. Didn't you dream of reaching the international level? This will open all doors for you." "All right, don't push it. I'll give you my decision tomorrow morning. Currently, I need to think about it." The director ushered everyone out of his office and began weighing the pros and cons. Stephanie came to clean late in the afternoon. When she stepped inside, Frank Nathanson was tossing a coin in the air. "Damn!" he snarled, but softened when he saw the young woman with a bucket and rag enter. "Heads or tails?" Stephanie smiled, getting down to business. "Tails for the 5th time." "And how many heads were there?" "6, he sighed, and suddenly realized he hadn't left his office all day. Thus, he decided to give the cleaning lady a chance to mop the floor without his presence. He went to the cafe, had tea and a croissant, and when he returned, he saw Stephanie sitting behind his desk. His eyebrows shot up. "I apologize for prying, but this concerns me too," Stephanie exclaimed. "If you sign this, the firm will go under, and I need to work for you for at least another 2 months. Mr. Nathanson stepped closer. "What are you talking about?" He remembered that Emma had called her an incredible specialist, and that she had been highly valued at her previous workplace. "Look, you have clauses that will make you pay huge compensation even if it's not your fault. Trust me, in practice, it's best not to get involved with such partners. They'll make you pay for all their potential expenses up front. You'll lose money and won't be able to sustain the project itself. And if you take out a loan and the deal falls through, which is likely, you'll simply go bankrupt with huge debts. This document is your death sentence." Frank began to argue, citing his deputy's words, but Stephanie demolished all his arguments. "I bet if Mr. Larson is lobbying for this project, he doesn't wish you well. He couldn't have missed that this would sink you. Do you understand? These clauses must be renegotiated." "Oh my goodness, Stephanie. So the project is a sham, and Mr. Larson sold out to the competition." "Do you see any other explanation?" Stephanie exclaimed, waving her hands. She herself would never have thought that Mr. Larson, who had always treated his boss so well and set him as an example to everyone, would suddenly betray him. The next day, Mr. Nathanson drove up to Stephanie's house at 8 a.m. and called her. "Good morning." She was surprised at such an early visit. "Good morning. Are you ready? I need you today. I want to publicly nail Mr. Larson. He'll explain everything to us and the board of shareholders about why he's lobbying for this deal. You know, I've been thinking and analysing, and I remembered a few things that confused me. Mr. Larson didn't want me to consult the shareholders. He was supposedly concerned about my credibility in the company." "What can I do? I gave you all the information. You're not one of those who can't retell the data, and you understand everything perfectly well. Maybe it's better without me." Stephanie chickened out. A cleaning lady going before the board of shareholders with her theories? What if she was kicked out in disgrace? She was sure of her conclusions, but what if she was wrong after all and was about to be publicly put on her spot? "You're not a cleaning lady anymore. You'll take Mr. Larson's place from this day forward. I came early so you could buy a suit. I'll take you to the store where my friend works, and they'll fit you for free." Should she have said no? Not take the risk? At that moment, Stephanie was terribly afraid, but she thought she could proudly declare in court that in a month she had been promoted from cleaning lady to assistant director of a large company. Thus, she got into Frank's expensive car with tinted windows and rushed towards her destiny. First, she picked out a chic cream business suit and shoes. She used to love heels, but after prison, she felt that those shoes were no longer for her. Standing on the stilettos, Stephanie looked at herself and realized that she looked stunning, even without any makeup. She was confident in her appearance, confident that she was right. When Stephanie entered the office, all those present who knew her as a cleaner gasped. Mr. Lawson's jaw dropped. "Stephanie, you haven't confused anything?" he asked haughtily. "Stephanie hasn't mixed up anything. Come in." Mr. Nathanson smiled at her. The meeting began with Mr. Nathanson bringing everyone up to speed. Then he passed the word to Stephanie, and she demolished the idea of signing a new contract with an unfamiliar company on strange terms that looked favourable at first glance. Mr. Larson blushed to the roots of his hair. It became obvious to everyone at the table that he had been bribed by competitors. The man flew out of the office, almost knocking down the secretary, whom he had been eyeing for months, hinting that he could arrange a raise if she would be more lenient to him. The same day, Mr. Larson wrote a letter of resignation and left. No one ever saw him again, neither in this office nor in this city. They say that he went to his younger sister in the capital, and there he started everything from the beginning. He got a job as an ordinary manager, but advanced quickly because he had a knack for going over people's heads. As it turned out later, he was not bribed. He just wanted Frank fired so he could be put in place of the stupid director. And then he would have made a mess of things. Access to the accounts and any opportunities would have been at his fingertips. From that same day, Stephanie began to work under Mr. Nathanson's direction in his office. He brought her up to speed and never ceased to be amazed at how quickly she grasped everything. They often had to stay up late. Stephanie was fine with it. She was interested in everything. "May I ask you something personal?" Frank said one day, tearing himself away from the papers. "Ask, although I think I know what about," answered Stephanie, and told her boss the whole story. How she grew up with Meredith, how she met Kyle, and how her friend had set her up. "Yeah, your life is like a detective movie. Except in the movies there's usually a good ending, while I don't know if they'll give me my son. My husband forbade me to see him. I called him and he said no. I can't even understand why he's doing this to me." "How long has it been since you've seen your child?" Frank asked. Stephanie sighed intermittently. "Almost 2 years. I was sentenced up just before New Year's." "Well, I have a feeling that you'll celebrate this New Year's Eve with your son I'll help you," he smiled. Stephanie smiled too. A tear rolled down her cheek, but she smiled. The very next day, Frank asked the company's lawyer to handle her case. The lawyer was competent in all matters, a true professional. The process started, and the lawsuit was filed. The trial was to take place just before the New Year holidays. Stephanie was very nervous. 3 days before the hearing, Frank again asked her to stay late. They were discussing the details of a new deal that could bring good income, provided the partner would make concessions on 2 important points of the contract. They went outside where it was quite dark. The snow was falling quietly. "I give you a ride home," Frank offered, and Stephanie got into his car. "Can I ask you a personal question?" she asked. "Go ahead," Frank answered without taking his eyes off the road. "Everyone in the office says you don't have a family, but you have a picture on your desk of you with a woman and a small child." Frank smiled. "I had a family. I married a woman with a child. Her name was Yulia. We lived together for 4 years and I considered her daughter mine. Everything was fine, and then she suddenly said she loved her ex and went to him. He was an athlete and was building a career abroad. My wife left me and went to him, took my stepdaughter. I was left alone." Stephanie frowned. "That's so sad." "Yeah, we can call each other, but every time I'm more and more convinced that they're better off there. He can give them more time and money. Athletes are paid well there, so I gave up." Stephanie sympathized with Frank and suddenly offered, "You know, we could go to the movies." Frank was confused. "Let's go." The next day they watched a thriller. Stephanie held Frank's hand the whole movie. They laughed together, discussed the plot. Later that night she fell asleep thinking that she had the best boss in the world, and that she had done the right thing, because she had helped him to unwind this evening. At the same time, she was not so nervous because the next day was the court date. Frank came there with her. When Stephanie entered the building, the lawyer leisurely approached. "The case is ours. Kyle filed for divorce, and that woman, his wife, never adopted Tommy. So, in this case, we should get the child back without any issues," he whispered to Stephanie before the process began. She glowed. What a piece of news. It's not good to rejoice in the failures of other people, but not in that case. In court, Stephanie's lawyer asked Kyle, "Is it true that you and your wife Meredith are in the process of divorcing?" Kyle lowered his head. "Yes, but that's irrelevant. I'm the boy's father." "All right," continued the lawyer. "And is it true that you lost your business and now you have no official source of income?" Stephanie was shocked. What a twist. She had only been gone for 2 years. What had happened to her husband's business in that time? "Our family has plenty of money," he replied. "That's irrelevant. You are now officially unemployed. You've been declared officially bankrupt, according to my sources. That's correct. Or am I wrong?" Kyle lowered his eyes. "That's right." At that point, the judge sighed. Stephanie spoke next. She walked in her impressive business suit and told what she got the sentence for, how everything really was. She did not conceal that she had signed without looking. Then the lawyer asked Frank, as Stephanie's direct employer, to give characteristics of her. However, to make a final decision, the judge called Tommy. Seeing his mother, the boy cried, "Mummy, where have you been for so long? I want my mummy!" he cried. Stephanie was tearing toward him, but she was seated. "I don't want to live with my dad any longer. That means Meredith is there. She hates me, and grandmother doesn't take care of me at all. After the death of her grandfather, she is sad all the time. I want to go to my mum. Please, can I live with her? Dad, I'm sorry, I'll visit you. I love you, but I want to live with my mum. You live with mum too, and I want to live with mine." Stephanie didn't know that her father-in-law had died. She was shocked again. Soon, the judge banged the gavel, announcing that Tommy was staying with his mum because he wanted to do so himself. The living conditions in Stephanie's apartment were suitable. The 3-bedroom apartment she lived in with her parents allowed them to raise their child. Stephanie left the courtroom with her son. He held his mother's hand so tightly, as if he were afraid that she would be taken away from him. "Stephanie, wait!" Kyle called out to her. She turned around. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" Stephanie asked, confused with squeamish. "For everything. Meredith and I broke up recently. I went bankrupt. The business collapsed when I invested all the money in my father's treatment. He was seriously ill and didn't survive the operation. After that, I couldn't get back into business. My competitors beat me to the punch. I lost my sports centre. Meredith said she didn't need a bankrupt and left me for my friend. I was shocked. I thought she really loved me, but only you truly loved me. When she left, she admitted she set you up. Not only did I cheat on you with her, but I didn't believe in your innocence. I didn't fight for you. You did time because of me. I was afraid you'd take Tommy, and you did. And now I'm all alone." Stephanie pressed her lips together. He had caught his boomerang. "I won't do what you did, Kyle. Tommy can live with me, but he can visit you. I guess he remains the only joy to your mother." "He is. Thank you, and I'm sorry." He turned around and walked away. For the first time in his life, Kyle had humbly asked for forgiveness. Stephanie sighed. At that moment, Frank approached them. "I invite everyone to the cafe. The lawyer is coming with us too. I've already made arrangements, and refusals aren't accepted." Tommy jumped joyfully, and Stephanie couldn't refuse. In the cafe, they ate ice cream and fooled around. Stephanie didn't notice how time flew by. "Tomorrow, stay with your son. I don't need you at work," Frank said. The woman thanked her boss, but it seemed insufficient for her. She hugged him, and it was so unexpected that Frank was speechless. He hugged her back. "And this is my second dad, yes?" Tommy asked in a childishly straightforward way. Stephanie immediately stepped aside of her boss. "No, come on, that's my boss. His name is Mr. Nathanson." Tommy chuckled. "That's no way to hug a boss." Stephanie and Frank laughed. Since that day, their relationship began to warm. Frank visited Stephanie's house and met her parents. They spent a lot of time together, but he didn't dare touch her. Stephanie sensed something was holding him back. "Frank, what's between us?" she asked one day, unable to bear it any longer. "It's all right, I think." "I just want to know. Tommy is attached to you and so am I. Are you my friend or something more?" Frank inhaled. "I'm something more, Stephanie. If you promise me you won't go back to Kyle later." "Is he coming to see you?" "I've seen him give flowers to you, and I've been through this before. I mean, I told you. I don't want to undergo it again. I'll get attached to you and you'll go back. Back to your ex. You're family, aren't you? And you have a mutual son." Stephanie realized the reason for his uncertainty. He betrayed me. He wouldn't let me see my own child out of spite. And he cheated on me with my friend. "No, I won't go back to him, even if my life depended on it," she said seriously. Frank nodded and took her hand. It was one of the few touches that had happened between them. From that day, everything changed. Frank believed her and felt more confident. Tommy became firmly attached to him. When they decided to get together, the boys smiled and said, "Finally, it's about time. You're adults, but you act like children." Stephanie and Frank managed the firm together. She was his right hand. All those women who had looked askance at her when she first came to work as a cleaner now tried to make amends. But Stephanie held no grudges. Everyone has their prejudices. She treated everyone in the company equally well, with understanding. Soon Stephanie and Frank had a wedding, to which Kyle and his mother were invited. They modestly congratulated the newlyweds and quickly left. Tommy had persuaded them to come. Once Stephanie visited their home and communicated with Kyle's mother, she said that she had always been on Stephanie's side and didn't approve of Meredith, whom her son had brought into the house, but the past couldn't be changed. A year after the wedding, Stephanie became pregnant and gave birth to Frank's first child, a charming daughter named Karina. A year later, their second lovely girl, Christina, was born. Both daughters resembled their father, but the youngest inherited her mother's chin and strong-willed character. So, Stephanie, despite the setup of her best friend, the treason of her first husband, a real term of imprisonment, still managed to get out of all this murky and dirty story.
All in all, ladies, it seems we need someone to take a business trip. One person will suffice. So, who's up for the journey?
A man, sitting in an impressive leather armchair, addressed the 3 female employees in front of him.
Based on my initial calculations, the business trip should take about a week. You should leave on Sunday to arrive by Monday, ready to start work.
The office was silent, with only a tune from the radio playing in the background.
So, any volunteers? Lucy, how about you?
Mr. Rudolph, I can't, replied the brunette with the stylish haircut. My son's birthday is next week. He's turning 10. I'd like to celebrate with him, so I can't go.
All right, that's a valid reason. Megan, are you up for it?
The pretty blonde shook her head, causing her luxurious curls to bounce. Why complicate things? Mary is from that city, let her go. I think that's a great idea. Another blonde, this one with straight hair, agreed. Exactly, Mr. Rudolph. Megan's suggestion makes sense. Who better than Mary to go? She can mix business with the pleasure of nostalgia and catching up with relatives. The man nodded.
Right, then all that's left to do is notify Mary. By the way, why isn't she at the meeting?
Quick thinking, Megan stood up for her colleague. You sent her to the supplier to negotiate a few points in the contract's annex. She'll probably be here soon. Sure enough, as soon as Megan finished speaking, there was a knock at the door, and a woman with ruddy brown skin and long hair, gathered in a high ponytail, entered the office. She sat down at the table with her colleagues, handed the chief a folder with documents, and explained, Sorry for being late. I got caught in a traffic jam. The boss nodded approvingly after reviewing the documents. Without preamble, he announced,
Mary, prepare for a trip. You have a business trip to your hometown for about a week. Any objections?
Mary shrugged her shoulders and said, If it's necessary, it's necessary. She began to clarify the tasks for the upcoming business trip, and Mr. Rudolph, having dismissed the other women to their workplaces, detailed the trip's specifics to her. Mary knew that her jealous husband Zach wouldn't be pleased about her week-long absence on a business trip. The upcoming trip to the city, where she spent her childhood and youth, stirred mixed feelings within her. While she looked forward to seeing her relatives, she also dreaded the potential for a painful encounter. In her hometown, Mary had suffered a significant disappointment because her first love hadn't resulted in happiness. His name was Bob Jeffries. He was her classmate, and they spent the last year of study dancing slow dances at school discos and strolling around the city under the enchanting twilight. From a girl smitten with love, Bob was more handsome than all the popular musicians in the world. With his short haircut, broad shoulders, sharply defined cheekbones, and a massive chin, he was very handsome and manly. His dark brown eyes seemed to gaze directly into her heart, easily discerning Mary's feelings of love. The girl had fantasized that Bob was the love of her life, and they would always be together. However, the guy was looking for a better option and found one effortlessly. He didn't even have to go far. He chose Kate Lampkus, an unpleasant, arrogant girl who always smelled of particularly strong perfume.
To her classmates, Kate boasted that her perfume was an original Chanel, allegedly purchased in Paris during a trip with her parents on her 16th birthday. Mary found out almost immediately that Bob was dating Kate. She smelled the unfamiliar perfume on his denim jacket from several meters away, prompting her to ask him directly. "What's going on?" Bob admitted honestly to having a sort of romance with Kate Lapkus, but also expressed his desire to continue meeting Mary secretly. Mary refused, and then she found out that Kate's father, a local businessman, had hired Bob to his company. It was clear to Mary that her lover had sold himself out, and for a substantial price by their local standards. What hurt her most was Bob's cynicism. He did not switch partners out of love, but for selfish reasons, and he wanted to keep Mary around for his amusement. The pain of betrayal was too intense for her to bear, so she decided to distance herself from the self-serving Bob. Masking her feelings, she told her parents that she wanted to try her luck in the capital. They discouraged her, warning her about the dangers and complexities of a big city. But surprisingly, everything turned out quite well. The provincial, as it sometimes happens, was just lucky. She found a job and met a man who could melt the ice in her heart. Zach was 7 years older than Mary, had already graduated from university, and held a normal position in a large concern. Their paths crossed when Zach took refuge in the coffee shop from a sudden downpour. While waiting for the rain to stop, he had the time to appreciate the young barista's attractiveness and good nature. She was welcoming to every visitor of the coffee shop. Moreover, she spoke correctly, a trait that Zach's mother Denise always said was a sign of good manners. After the rain had left the sidewalks shiny and full of puddles, Zach, ready to leave, asked the beautiful barista for her phone number. For their first date, Zach quickly swept the provincial girl into a whirlwind of courtship. His sincerity dispelled any lingering doubts in her mind. It was Zach who convinced her to leave the coffee shop and take an office job at his former classmate's company. This classmate had become the boss due to his familial ties with the general director. Jokingly, Zach explained, "Ben Rudolph and I are good friends. I trust him completely. He will look after you and won't let anyone offend you. That way, I can be sure you will avoid any workplace shenanigans and romances." Surprisingly, Zach quickly introduced Mary to his mother. Denise accepted her warmly, and the fact that Mary was a newcomer and only had a school education didn't bother her. She hadn't expected Mary to captivate her hard-to-please son to the point of marriage, but that's precisely what happened. Denise knew better than to dissuade her son, as it could severely damage their relationship. Mary's parents were very fond of their son-in-law, and Mary herself was blissfully happy. Life in the capital brought her love and work effortlessly. It seemed almost magical. Living with her mother-in-law in the same apartment could have been a challenge for some, but not for Mary. She was confident she could get along with anyone for the sake of her husband, especially since Denise had always been reasonable and sensible. The couple decided to focus on savings for a mortgage down payment and investing a little in the renovation of Denise's apartment. Contrary to popular prejudices, the two housewives, a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, peacefully shared the same kitchen, without any squabbles or discontent. Hearing her colleagues complain about their in-laws, Mary quietly rejoiced in her good fortune. Everyone was satisfied, especially Zach, as his mother and wife didn't compete for his attention, creating a cozy and pleasant atmosphere in their apartment. When, during the dinner, Mary informed Zach that she would be going on a week-long business trip, he got visibly upset and exclaimed, "Why on earth did your boss decide to send you? Aren't there any other employees? He knows my stance on your travels." Mary attempted to soothe her husband, saying, "Zach,
Who else but me can go to my hometown? I won't even need to rent a hotel. My parents will be happy to host me. So don't worry. Understand that I can't take advantage of the fact that my immediate superior is your friend to avoid travel for work matters. Besides, don't you trust me?" Zack remained stoic. He understood that his wife's work trip did not pose a threat to their marriage, but despite many years of marriage, he disliked the idea of a long separation. He admitted, "No, it's not that. I trust you, and I understand that meeting your parents is a great bonus of this trip. It's just that I'm going to miss you." Denise, who had lately been arriving home from work much later than the young people, as she referred to her son and daughter-in-law, walked in on a peaceful scene in the kitchen. Mary and Zack sat on the sofa arm in arm. The elderly Tom, the cat, was snoozing next to them. Well-fed and content with his life. Mary noticed her mother-in-law and began setting the table for her. "Zack and I have already eaten. I'll set the table for you now, and then we can all have tea together." Zack's mother gently patted her sleeping pet, who murmured worriedly. After washing her hands and changing her clothes, she joined them at the table. Denise ate her dinner happily, merely nodding when she heard that her daughter-in-law would soon be going on a business trip. Although the woman at first glance behaved as usual, Mary noticed that mentally she was somewhere far away, and did not even reproach the cat for his laziness in ignoring her appearance in the apartment. However, there was no time to think about it too closely. It was necessary to get ready for the road. As she saw Mary off, Denise sent verbal greetings to her parents and seemed to behave as usual. This reassured Mary, who dismissed her earlier thoughts about her mother-in-law's strange behaviour. Her focus shifted to her upcoming trip back home. At the airport, Mary was met with the usual bustle. Ignoring the insistent taxi drivers preying on tired and hurried travellers, she made her way to the bus stop. Mary didn't let her parents know about her arrival to avoid causing unnecessary fuss. She knew that otherwise her mother would have prepared a feast fit for a wedding. Each time she approached her home, an inexplicable feeling overwhelmed her. Her anticipation of a joyful reunion was tangled with both happy and sad memories, causing her heart to beat a little faster. Seeing the kitchen light on, she knew her family was home. She unlocked the door to her parents' apartment and announced loudly, "Hello, everyone." Her parents were thrilled with their daughter's surprise visit, but a situation cast a shadow over their reunion. The mother confessed, "Mary, we made reservations at the sanatorium for Wednesday. It was a last-minute trip and we didn't expect you to visit." She paused, then turned to her husband. "Should we give our spot to someone else?" "No, Mum," Mary protested. "Don't change your plans on my account. I'll be travelling for work and will likely only be home for the night. Don't worry, we'll have enough time to catch up. It's fine." Her mother gave her a tight hug and whispered, "All right, dear, let's believe that everything happens for the best." Mary's business trip was far from a vacation. As expected, every day she left home in the morning and didn't return until the evening. However, on the day of her parents' departure, she altered her busy schedule and escorted her parents to the train station. After bidding them farewell, she then attended to her work commitments. Consequently, her day was hectic, and by evening she was totally worn out. As she neared her house, all she could think about was relaxing in a foamy bath. Suddenly a familiar voice called out to her. Mary turned around, more irritated than surprised, and greeted Bob. The grown-up classmate showered her with compliments. "Mary, I'm impressed. You've become even more refined. You were beautiful before, but now you're top-notch. The capital has influenced you. You're so stylish now." While the man who had once broken her heart, but who had unwittingly helped her find happiness, was spewing flattering phrases, Mary studied him carefully. Surprisingly, time had been kind to him. Bob Jeffries seemed more masculine, and his self-assuredness and apparent wealth made him irresistible, at least in his own eyes.
"Well, Mary, why are you silent? Aren't you happy to see me?" he asked.
"Listen, Kate is staying with our children at her parents' house tonight. By the way, you probably don't know, but we have a 2-year-old son and a daughter who was born 3 months ago." "Congratulations," Mary responded flatly, not particularly interested in his life. Bob, undeterred, pressed on.
"Listen, Mary, how about going to my place? We could celebrate our meeting, chat, and reminisce about our past. Remember our romance, how we used to walk hand in hand, dreaming of the future. Could we pick up where we left off? I heard you married a guy from the capital. Good for you. However, why are you here alone? Is your husband too busy earning money to spend time with you? I can make everything better."
Mary was deeply disgusted, almost to the point of nausea. The last thing she wanted was to interact with Bob. Without any pretense of politeness, she dismissively sent her former boyfriend away.
"Go to your place alone. Go, and don't look back,"
Mary said, and turning sharply, walked towards the entrance.
"You're too arrogant,"
a scornful phrase followed her. But Mary had no intention of reacting to his insult. Let Bob say what he wanted. Neither his words nor his once impressive appearance held any power over her now. They no longer stirred any nostalgia or bitterness. It was wonderfully liberating to finally let go of her resentment towards the past. After rewarding herself with a relaxing bath, Mary felt invigorated. Her work was progressing better than expected, and there was hope of finishing her business trip ahead of schedule. She missed her husband deeply. Moreover, there was nothing or no one in her hometown that could compel her to stay. And indeed, everything was finished before the plan, and by Thursday afternoon, Mary had already booked tickets for the next train to the capital. She tidied up her parents' apartment and set off home. When she got home late that night, she was surprised, for the apartment was empty, except for the furry Tom. It appeared that both Zack and Denise were held up at work, leaving the pet hungry. "What, Tom, have you not eaten for a while?" Mary asked with a smile, not expecting an answer. However, the cat seemed to understand her, responding with a long meow. Looking back at Mary, it continued towards the kitchen. Mary fed the tail extortionist, refreshed his water, and noticed the overflowing trash can, which emitted unpleasant odours. She carefully took out the bag and went to the trash cans in the yard. The lantern's light was enough to prevent her from stumbling, guiding her to her destination. As she prepared to dispose of the garbage, she heard voices from behind the metal sheet, separating the containers from the pavement. One voice was unmistakably familiar to Mary. She listened more intently and recognized it as her mother-in-law's, who was unaware of her presence just 7 meters away. It was a rather unexpected situation. Mary intended to slip away unnoticed when suddenly she heard her name mentioned. Overcome with curiosity, she decided to stay put. Despite chastising herself for it, it became clear that what Denise was discussing was not intended for her ears. "Mary's away on a business trip, but judging by the light in the windows, my son must be home. Otherwise, I would have invited you in," she heard her mother-in-law say. A deep, unfamiliar male voice responded in a flattering tone. "Darling, you realize that at our age, hiding in various rented places isn't a viable option, let alone hygienic. I wish you nothing but the best, and I'm so embarrassed that I can't offer you my own apartment. After my divorce, I left everything to my wife and son, and now I feel bad for taking you, the woman I love,
to all sorts of rented apartments. I feel incredibly guilty, but you know, I care for you so much. It's more than love. It's adoration. You are like a goddess to me, a true blessing from fate that I don't deserve."
There was a brief silence, broken only by the sound of a kiss. Mary stood still, too scared to move, until she heard Denise's timid response.
"I understand everything, Joshua, and I appreciate your feelings for me, but what can I do? I can't evict my son and daughter-in-law, who is like a daughter to me, and leave them homeless. They are saving money to buy a house, and, moreover, they completely renovated my apartment with their own money. How can I kick them out?"
Once again, the male voice rumbled. Persuasive, resolute, and insistently, he said,
"My dear Denise, what this provincial weasel and your son have done is simply their duty. They were trying for the most part for their own comfort. Your Zack is a grown man, married, and it's time he sorted out his housing situation himself. You've given him everything you could. You just need to show him and his wife the door. There's no need to wait for a suitable occasion to put this matter off. Act fast. When your cunning provincial daughter-in-law has a baby, your apartment won't be valued highly on the market with a minor tenant. You'll need to sell it at a substantial discount, losing a considerable amount of money. And for what? Out of pity for your son and daughter-in-law? You should pity yourself first. We could be sitting on the sofa in your cosy living room discussing paintings or movies, but instead we're like teenagers hanging around on the streets and sleeping on other people's pillows. I'm fed up with this instability."
Denise timidly objected.
"Joshua, you have repeatedly suggested that I free the apartment from Mary and Zack. I can't imagine how to do that. If I ask my son to move, he'll be upset. Should I stir up a scandal so that my daughter-in-law leaves with her husband? It's odd. She's done nothing wrong. In fact, Mary is tidy, cooks well and never causes trouble. We haven't even had a single argument in all 3 years."
The invisible interlocutors fell silent. Fearing that now they would go in the direction of the house, Mary quietly, so as not to give away her presence, and without throwing away the garbage bag, hurried back home. She needed to reach home before her mother-in-law and keep her eavesdropping a secret. Running as fast as she could, she reached the bushes that concealed her route to the entry door. Inside the apartment, she put the unpleasant-smelling bag on the balcony, sighed, and remembered her grandmother's old saying, "Nothing should be thrown out in the evening." Yet one could argue that if she hadn't tried to get rid of the source of the foul smell, she wouldn't have overheard the peculiar conversation. Mary was intrigued by the conversation between her mother-in-law and a stranger named Joshua, not because she feared leaving their comfortable apartment for rented accommodation, but due to the hint of insincerity in Joshua's voice. She knew she must tread carefully to avoid offending Denise. Mary had just finished unpacking when the lady of the house came into the apartment. "Mary, have you been here long?" she exclaimed, surprised. "No, Denise. I arrived about 10 minutes ago. I managed to finish my chores early. My parents are in a sanatorium, so I hurried back. I missed you and Zack," replied Mary. Denise warmly smiled at Mary and said, "That's good. Zack should arrive soon. He's been swamped at work all week. You must be hungry from the trip. Why don't you have something to eat?" Mary declined, saying, "No, thank you. I'll take a shower and freshen up. We can dine together when Zack returns." The mother-in-law responded with a nod and a half-smile. Mary was puzzled. Was it possible that this woman could pretend so well that she showed no sign of her discontent or thoughts about separating from her son's family? Or was Mary too oblivious to her mother-in-law's emotions that she missed all the signs? After all,
Denise's affair with Joshua hadn't started yesterday. He was already giving advice on how she should handle her property. Mary regretted eavesdropping on the conversation. If she hadn't, everything would have remained normal. Now she had to subtly convince her husband to consider moving to a rental, or better yet, buying their apartment via a mortgage finally. The morning didn't clarify how she should proceed. Despite the opportunity to rest for another day, she chose to go to work, hoping it would distract her from her troubling thoughts. Mr. Rudolph greeted her warmly, while her colleagues expressed surprise that she didn't extend her weekend. It did not even occur to her to open up. But not because Lucy, Megan and Holly were bad, jealous or stupid. It was just that the relationship between the colleagues did not go beyond working cooperation. They would chat during lunch and occasionally go shopping or to the theatre after work, but they respected each other's personal boundaries. Barely waiting for the end of the working day, as agreed, she met with her husband to reward each other for the separation with joint entertainment. After the movie, she initiated a carefully planned conversation. "Zach, isn't it time for us to get our own place?" Mary asked. Zach was visibly surprised. "Why would you say that, Mary? Are we not living well with my mum? I've never noticed any disagreements. Why should we move all of a sudden?" Mary, embarrassed to admit that she had overheard a conversation of her mother-in-law, tried to justify herself. "You're right, we don't have any misunderstandings. But your mum is still young. She's almost 55, which isn't considered prime age these days. Denise is a real beauty and looks youthful. Maybe she has plans for her personal life, and we might get in her way." Zach laughed. "My mum is indeed beautiful and looks great. But trust me, after my father left to pursue happiness with another woman, his so-called new love, she sees all men as betrayers. I've occasionally reminded her that she's a vibrant woman deserving love, but she outright rejects this, calling it nonsense. So, we're not in her way at all. Who knows, she might even struggle being alone." Mary agreed that it wasn't quite right to divulge his mother-in-law's personal secrets, even to her son. If Denise was serious about Joshua, it was her right to introduce him to the family. Fortunately, she didn't need to keep her mother-in-law's secret for long. Less than a week later, a flustered Denise announced, "I have a surprise for you. This weekend, a man I'm seeing romantically is coming to visit. I hope you can welcome him warmly. He's already nervous enough about meeting you." Caught off guard by the news, Zach fell silent. Seeing that her mother-in-law was expecting some form of support, Mary reassured her. "Denise, don't worry. We will meet your guest with open arms. Right, Zach?" The stunned man nodded in agreement. "I'll help you prepare the treats, of course. Let's just decide what will be on the table, shall we?" the daughter-in-law continued. By the time the guest was expected to arrive, everything was ready. The table was laid out according to all the rules of hospitality. As the time for Denise's beloved to meet her son and his wife drew nearer, she became increasingly anxious. The unyielding minute hand on the kitchen clock seemed to mock her, moving forward, while their guest was yet to arrive. At his mother's request, Zach even went down to the entrance to check if the intercom was working. After confirming that it was, he tried to reassure her. There must be traffic jams on the road. Nervously, Denise attempted to call the man she was waiting for, but to no avail. The answering machine informed her that Joshua's phone was either turned off or out of reach. Mary struggled to find comforting words for her distressed mother-in-law, who was absent-mindedly folding paper napkins into origami. When Denise's smartphone chimed with a melodious ringtone, she hastily picked up and asked, "Hello, is that you, Joshua? What's the matter? Where are you?" Mary tactfully retreated to the other room, where her husband was engrossed in a computer game, and quietly told him, "It seems that our guest is finally founded, but he didn't show up in person, and instead called your mum?" Zack merely shrugged, replying, "Well, I did tell you, he's probably stuck in traffic somewhere." A few minutes later, a distraught Denise entered her son and daughter-in-law's room. "Joshua was attacked while walking towards us. Someone hit him from behind and robbed him. He was unconscious for a bit, but managed to ask a store employee to use their phone. Luckily, Joshua has an incredible memory and knew my number by heart. He's at the emergency room now. I asked him to come here then, and he initially refused, but I insisted. Why should he endure this alone and keep replaying the attack in his mind? It's better for him to be with us, right?" "Of course," replied Zack, and suggested, "Listen, Mum, why don't I go and pick Joshua up from the hospital? That way we can ensure he gets here safely without any more incidents." Denise smiled. "Son, I knew I raised you to be kind and considerate, but I've already called a cab for Joshua on my smartphone. The car is on its way." Soon the doorbell rang. Joshua appeared at the doorstep, looking less than ideal. His light beige suit was covered in dust and sweat stains, and there was a fresh abrasion on his cheek. Joshua smiled apologetically at Zack, who answered the door and introduced himself. "My name is Joshua Bell. You must be Zack, right? You look so much like your mother. In fact, you two could be mistaken for siblings, given how stunningly beautiful Denise is. It's unfortunate that our long-awaited meeting has to be under such circumstances, but I couldn't do anything about the unexpected attack from behind." Denise joined the two men and began to fuss over her guest. "Oh, Joshua, come in. You've had such a hard time. Zack, please bring some of your things. Let Joshua change his clothes." To Mary's surprise, the man whose conversation she had heard at the dumpster was quite confident when he appeared in the hallway. He greeted her warmly, saying it was a pleasure to meet her. He thanked Zack for the things he had brought and went to the bathroom to change and tidy up. It seemed that the recent incident hadn't affected Joshua's mood at all. Zack asked the man how he planned to find his attackers. "I probably won't report to the police," the man said. "I used to work in law enforcement, and I know that pursuing this legally would be futile. I still have some connections, so I'll handle this myself. It'll be faster and more effective." Once everyone gathered around the table, Joshua confidently introduced himself. He spoke about his past and present and the promising future. According to Joshua, meeting Denise restored his faith in real women who value genuine feelings. "As a decent man, I left a significant portion of my property to my ex-wife when we separated. We had lost almost all common ground. I have no obligation to pay alimony since our son is almost 20, but I help him as much as I can. Fortunately, I have a steady job, and in fact, I was at the origin of this firm and am one of the heads. Even though I currently rent a room in a hostel, I'm far from poor. In fact, I'm content with my life. If Denise agrees to marry me in the future, I will handle our housing situation like a real man should." Denise, who was serving a shrimp salad to her guest, shuddered and dropped a few pieces onto the tablecloth. The man didn't seem to notice and continued. "Unfortunately, the ring with its case was stolen from me, but I don't want to spoil this wonderful evening. I promise to present you, Denise, with the most beautiful ring I can find." Mary noticed her mother-in-law's embarrassment and couldn't understand how this seemingly wise woman could believe every word from Joshua. His tone was insincere, overly sweet, like a marshmallow dipped in honey and covered in powdered sugar. However, she might have been the only one who noticed, because she had overheard Joshua's plan to remove the pesky obstacles of Mary and Zack from his beloved's path earlier. Contrary to his actions near the trash cans, the guest was showering Denise, her son, and daughter-in-law with compliments at the table. "Zack, Denise has spoken so highly of you that I initially thought it was just a mother's exaggeration, but after meeting you, I confess my mistake. It's heartening to see how you care for your mother. Mary, you too are an admirable person. Your hard work commands genuine respect, and it's a joy to see how well you treat your mother-in-law." Feeling almost like the host, the man poured drinks and proposed a toast. "Zach and Mary, I wish your family happiness and prosperity. I've noticed how well you understand each other, and I wish Denise and I could share such harmony. Let's also toast to mutual understanding and hopefully a strong family friendship." Mary was taken aback by Joshua's hypocrisy. He could arguably win an award for his acting skills, but her intuition suggested he wasn't aiming for an acting accolade, but a more valuable prize, like the chance to move into a comfortable apartment and live happily. Denise smiled at her suitor, blinded to his hypocrisy. Perhaps it wasn't her fault. Even Zach, who was observing the guest intently, seemed to appreciate his sweet speeches. If Mary dared to suggest that Joshua wasn't sincere and was only interested in Denise's property, it could disrupt their peaceful relationship. There was only one way out of the stalemate: to sit quietly and to watch how events would develop. Meanwhile, Joshua went on with his offensive, and at the end of the evening, when the excited Denise and Mary served dessert, he asked for a moment's attention. "Denise, will you marry me? Or do you need time to think?" he asked. Denise put her hands to her flushed cheeks and nodded. Joshua quickly moved to her side, embraced her, and started kissing her, unperturbed by Zach and Mary's presence. Then he turned to Zach, his arms still around Denise's waist, and asked, "Will you bless your mother's happiness? It's crucial to me that you understand and accept this. Your mother deserves happiness, and I intend to provide it for her." Zach nodded. Mary, taken aback by this rapid turn of events, didn't dare to disrupt the tender moment by revealing that the sweet-voiced Joshua planned to build his happiness in Denise's territory after first removing his future wife's relatives from the apartment. From that evening, Mary's future mother-in-law's fiancé began to frequent his bride's apartment almost daily. On the next available working day, the mature lovers applied for marriage at the registry office and set a wedding date. Denise began to prepare the second wedding in her life. Meanwhile, Joshua took charge of arranging the restaurant, choosing a toastmaster, and other details, sparing his beloved from these concerns. "My dear Denise, why burden yourself with all this? I'll choose the best options and present them to you for consideration. We'll go with whatever you prefer. Focus on your dress, jewellery, stylist, and whatever else you need." As the wedding day approached, Denise was still undecided about her wedding dress. One day, she invited her daughter-in-law to join her in visiting boutiques and shoe stores. Mary was delighted and agreed. It was heartening to see Denise, who became more cheerful and even appeared rejuvenated as she tried on various dresses and suits. She enjoyed posing in front of the mirrors, although she was adamant about not wearing a veil or snow-white clothes, as she didn't want to make people laugh, in her own words. However, the experienced consultants in the stores were unfazed by this. It doesn't matter at what age happiness finds people. As a result, after many hours of trying on clothes, a beautiful dress in an incredibly refreshing shade of purple was selected for the mature bride. The dress was paired with marvellous shoes with sturdy heels. However, Denise was slightly taken aback by the price of the outfit. Reacting quickly, Mary said with her card, saying, "Nothing is too much for a special day. Besides, the dress doesn't just fit you. It's as if it were tailored just for you. Plus, it's not just for the wedding. It's perfect for any festive event." Denise smiled sincerely. "Thank you, Mary, for helping me decide. I probably would have chosen a more budget-friendly option. Remember the light suit from the department, where the bright scarlet dress was displayed on the mannequin at the entrance. But then I would have regretted it. Now, let's find something interesting for you." Mary agreed, not because she needed a new outfit. She already had a well-cut dress, but she simply enjoyed the bonding experience with her mother-in-law during the outfit search. However, the more she conversed with Denise, the more she realized that Joshua's influence on her was far from positive. While taking a break at the cafe during their shopping centre marathon, Mary's mother-in-law refused to eat anything and instead sipped unsweetened green tea. This puzzled Mary, as Denise was known for her sweet tooth and usually ordered cheesecake or a milkshake whenever possible. Denise explained that she was trying to lose weight because Joshua preferred slim women, and she even considered surgery to reduce her stomach size for more effective weight loss. Mary was taken aback by this, knowing that Denise was terrified of surgical procedures. She even avoided getting a minor ingrown toenail procedure at the clinic, choosing instead to home treat it for 2 weeks. This sudden revelation about considering surgery was both unexpected and concerning, especially since Denise's figure was near perfect and Joshua's behaviour seemed tactless and unfair. Seeing that the groom had taken too much power over his bride, Mary became anxious because if her mother-in-law was thinking about the operation, she would sooner or later support Joshua's idea of vacating the apartment. So, it was impossible to postpone the conversation with her husband and confess to the overheard conversation. And she finally initiated a difficult conversation. "Listen, Zach, this Joshua strikes me as insincere. He says all the right things, but something feels off about him. Besides, he's pushing your mum to lose weight. And there's more." She then shared everything she had overheard near the trash cans and suggested, "Let's not wait for your mum to ask us to leave. It would be too awkward for her. Let's calculate our savings, make the first mortgage payment, and move into our own apartment. Even if it's not the house we dreamed of, but it will be our first place." Zach appeared troubled and stunned his wife with his own confession. "I gave about a half of our savings to Joshua this morning. He said he didn't have enough for the wedding. And he also wanted to buy my mum a travel trip and a car as a wedding present. He had money on bank deposit, but he didn't want to withdraw his funds from it in the end date and lose interest. He promised he'll pay it all back in a month, once his deposit matures." Mary tried to maintain her composure, even attempting to soothe her husband. "Well, there is a silver lining. We're not facing eviction anytime soon. When Joshua repays the money, we'll be back on track with the idea of our own apartment." Feeling guilty, Zach started to defend himself. "I'm sorry, Mary. I don't know how I got swayed by his arguments. He made it sound so logical. We're about to become family, and he promised to repay me with a small bonus. I was so captivated by the trip he planned to buy for my mum as a surprise honeymoon gift. I didn't even ask for a handwritten promissory note. Surely he isn't going to deceive me, is he?" Mary harboured some doubts, but chose not to voice them so as not to upset Zach even further. Instead, she tried to lift his spirits. "Don't worry. Joshua is marrying your mum in less than a week. We're not going to damage their relationship by demanding a promissory note now, are we? Let's focus on preparing for the party." Despite reassuring her husband, Mary was anxious. By her calculations, her husband had given Joshua about 30,000. However, there was nothing to be done about it. Mary took solace in the fact that she had no more secrets from Zach. Denise and Joshua's wedding was splendid. Joshua was touchingly attentive to his now official wife. All the guests were certain that this marriage would be strong and happy. Joshua dramatically knelt and presented his gift to his beloved, saying, "Denise, you are my goddess. I pondered how to thank you for agreeing to be my wife. After a few sleepless nights, I thought of it. I suggest we take a trip to the island where, according to legend, Aphrodite herself lived." The guests warmly applauded Joshua's romantic gesture and generous gift. However, Mary felt a twinge of resentment, knowing that the voyage was not financed by her new husband, but by the savings of her and her husband. Their first night as newlyweds was spent in a luxury hotel room, and then they returned to Denise's apartment. Zack and Mary prepared a breakfast of delicacies to welcome them, but Mary noticed Denise seemed unusually anxious. Finding a moment when their husbands were fixing a suddenly broken washing machine, she asked, "Denise, what's wrong? You seem lost in thought."
"Oh, Mary," she replied, "late last night Joshua received a call from his business partner. Our peaceful honeymoon is likely over. We may have to cancel our trip. His partner can trust only Joshua to inspect a branch in Alaska. I was looking forward to a week of basking in the sun and swimming in warm waves. Crete has always been a dream of mine. It would have been a perfect holiday in the velvet season, but sadly, it's not meant to be." Mary attempted to comfort her mother-in-law. "There are times when we must adjust our plans. My mother always told me, everything that doesn't happen is for the best. That's how fate has ordained it. At least Tom won't miss you." Denise, holding the cat that had just strutted past the sofa, stroked her fluffy pet and agreed. "Exactly. At least Tom won't suffer. Although, to be honest, I don't think he cares who feeds him, provides water or cleans his litter box, as long as it's all done on time." The conversation shifted from the cancelled vacation to discussing the temperaments of cats in general, and Tom's temperament in particular. This was much more enjoyable than dwelling on something that couldn't be changed. When Joshua and Zack rejoined the women, Denise seemed to be in a better mood. After their breakfast, Joshua suggested, "If no one objects, I'll sleep here tonight. I still haven't chosen a suitable place for us to live together, especially since my room is paid for 2 months in advance. There's no reason to waste money on something extra." No one objected. Perhaps Zack felt a bit uncomfortable, thinking that his mother would be in the next room with Joshua, but he didn't voice his concern. Mary didn't feel she had any say in the matter. After all, since her mother-in-law was married, where else should her husband sleep but with his wife? The next day, Mary offered her co-workers her mother-in-law's Crete trip voucher. Holly jumped at the idea of a vacation on the island. "I still have an unused vacation. I think Mr. Rudolph will be able to sign a week for me. You girls will cover for me, won't you?" The colleagues agreed. Given there was no significant backlog at work, why not let someone enjoy a seaside vacation? However, when Mary tried to arrange the ticket's sale with her mother-in-law, she was told to contact Joshua, as he held all the necessary information. Joshua disappointed both Mary and Holly, who was already looking forward to a pleasant trip. "Oh, Mary, I'm sorry, but I've already sold the tickets. My employee came to me after finding out I'm going on a business trip," he said. Joshua's business trip ended even sooner than expected. Upon his return, he moved into his wife's apartment without seeking anyone's approval. He brought with him not only his essential items, but also souvenirs from the north: Alaska bear claw salad and pasta server, woolen scarf, and magnets from the town visited. Despite Joshua's evident joy of being near his beloved Denise again, Mary, however, felt uncomfortable with the attention she was receiving from him. He was clearly interested in her, but he managed not to cross the line of decency. Sometimes Mary thought she might be imagining things, yet he was always looking at her. She was unsure how to respond to his gaze, and tried to limit their time together as much as possible. However, living in the same apartment made it impossible to avoid him completely. Joshua's unintentional touches, like when he took something from her hands, made Mary feel uneasy. One day he even slapped her lower back and suggested they shower together.
Mary responded by slapping Joshua and locking herself in her room for the rest of the day, skipping dinner and claiming she wasn't feeling well. In the evening, when Zack brought his wife a cup of tea, she asked him to sit and began to tell. "Listen to me calmly and don't rush to retaliation. I don't want you to get into trouble, as this man seems to have connections with the police. I can't live here anymore. Joshua has become too forward, and it feels like he's observing me. Zack, I think he's trying to piss me off, so I can get you to move out of the apartment." "Okay, he's won. I can't take it anymore. It's not only disgusting and immoral, but also unfair to your mother. She trusts Joshua, while he behaves inappropriately. Let's retrieve the money he took and leave. I don't want to cause a rift between your mother and me, but I know if I tell her the truth, it would lead to a conflict." Zack was taken aback. He couldn't believe such a scandal was taking place right under his nose. When morning came and only he and Joshua were left in the apartment, Zack decided to have a conversation with him. He started on a neutral note. "Listen, how's your bank deposit? Has it come to its end? I need my money." Joshua was not embarrassed. "Oh, here's the thing. When I was on a business trip, the contract was automatically extended and all accumulated interest was added to the principal deposit, as per the terms of a contract. I'm sorry to make you wait, but withdrawing the deposit now would mean a loss. If it's urgent, I'll borrow money from a friend tomorrow to repay you. It's embarrassing for me too." Joshua looked so remorseful that Zack felt guilty for asking for his money back. However, he still had another important issue to discuss. He asked directly, "Okay, I can wait a few more weeks for the debt, but why are you constantly looking at my wife? It's inappropriate. She is complaining about your harassment. What's that all about?" Joshua seemed shocked. "Zack, I hope you don't believe it. Mary is like a daughter to me, and she's married. A taboo. Moreover, she's your wife. How could I disrespect her like that?" Zack began to question Mary's truthfulness, as Joshua spoke too convincingly, but he still asked, "So you didn't touch her inappropriately?" Joshua was outraged. "Of course not. I didn't want to talk about it, but it's your wife who bothers me. I kept quiet to avoid upsetting you and Denise, but she's always around me. It's awkward. I've told Mary multiple times to behave appropriately, but she seems to provoke me deliberately. She probably wants to tarnish my image in Denise's eyes." Mary, who had returned home for her forgotten purse and inadvertently overheard a conversation not meant for her, stormed into the room. "Well, Joshua, repeat everything you just said with your vile tongue, but this time look me in the eye. Am I the one being dishonest? You, rusty mushroom, speak up, but don't overdo it. You're giving me a hard time, and you're making it look like it's the other way around. Aren't you ashamed of lying like this? You're a mature man, but instead of wisdom, you're filled with malice. You're a despicable person. Not even a person, but you slouching animal." Joshua wrinkled his nose. "Zack, where did you find such a country bumpkin? What kind of language is this? It's as if your Mary was raised in a tavern. Her parents must be uncivilized. They didn't teach her how to speak to elders." Mary was livid. "Don't you dare mention my parents. Why bring up my origins? That's irrelevant, because you truly are a despicable person. Clearly we're not having a constructive conversation, so we'll proceed legally. Now sit down and write a statement that you borrowed money from Zack on a specific date and that you'll repay it by New Year's Eve. My husband is an honourable man, and for some reason he trusted your word. Given your constant lies, this is the only way to deal with you, by documenting all agreements. Disgusting. Not a man at all. Joshua grinned. By the way, I didn't borrow the money from you. I borrowed it from your husband. So you don't have the right to boss me around. I negotiated with him, not with you. Zach is a good man, and you need to keep quiet. Mary, feeling indignant, turned to her husband. Zach, why are you silent? I'm being insulted, and you're taking his word over mine? You're risking our money. Tell him to sit down and write a promissory note. You can't trust his word. Joshua continued smirking. Listen to your wife, Zach. Let her boss you around, and you will turn into a henpecked. Shaken, Zach finally spoke up. Not to Joshua, but to his wife. Mary, please calm down and go to work. We'll sort this out man to man. It's not your place to tell us what to do. Mary was on the verge of tears from frustration. How could her beloved Zach suddenly side with Joshua? She grabbed her purse and left the apartment, a place where she had been happy for many years. On her way to work, Mary managed to calm down slightly, but she was still upset by her husband's behaviour. Instead of defending me, Zach chose to side with the other man. How can I rely on him if he behaves so cowardly and irrationally in a critical situation? She wondered. Her colleagues noticed that Mary, who arrived a bit late, seemed upset. When asked, she shrugged it off and blamed it on resulting insomnia. Megan suggested sleeping pills, and Lucy offered the contact of a sleep specialist. Mary politely thanked her colleagues and noted the information, but her thoughts remained focused on her marriage. She wondered if it was worth maintaining the relationship, if her husband wouldn't trust her word. How could she prove Joshua was lying? How should she react in the future? Mary attempted to call Zach, but he seemed to be ignoring her calls. Assuming that he was just occupied, she tried to focus on her work and not let the thoughts about her mother-in-law's unpleasant husband distract her. That evening, Mary arrived home to an unwelcome surprise. All her belongings were packed into 2 suitcases in the hallway. Denise summoned her into the kitchen and demanded, "Give me your set of keys to my apartment. I won't tolerate such insolence in my home. Your lies have given Joshua a heart attack. Thankfully, Zach hadn't left for work yet and was able to take him to the clinic. Now, get out of my sight." Mary felt betrayed. She couldn't believe that no one trusted her. However, she was not ready to give up and asked, "Denise, listen to me. You probably heard a distorted version of our argument with Joshua. I want to tell you what really happened. Your husband borrowed money from Zach without giving a promissory note. That wasn't enough for him, though. To free up the apartment, Joshua manipulated Zach's opinion, which led to our argument. You believed his version of the story and packed my things. It's very hurtful. Your husband won't stop at getting me out of your apartment. Zach will be next. You're so blinded by love for Joshua that you can't see he's driving your closest ones away. You should be chasing him away, especially after he made you doubt your figure. Can't you see it? He's an invader, arrogant, unprincipled, initially flattering but ultimately toxic, poisoning the atmosphere." Denise, not tolerating the attacks on her beloved husband, pointed the daughter-in-law at the door. "Get out!" Mary placed her keys on the table, grabbed her suitcases, and headed to a hotel. "Well, you never know how your day will unfold," she thought bitterly. Who could have predicted I'd be looking for a place to sleep tonight? Maybe it's my fault. I should have confronted that despicable Joshua after overhearing that conversation near the trash can. But who could have seen this coming? Distraught, Mary cried into her pillow before falling into a troubled sleep, without waiting for her husband's call. In her dreams, she saw distorted faces of her mother-in-law, her husband, who morphed into a goat with large horns and a beard, and the cheeky smile of Bob Jeffries, who teased her about her phone ringing and offered comfort. In one scene, Zach, as short as a preschooler, was begging Denise for candy. The dream's strange whirlwind of images only ended with the sound of the alarm clock. Despite her personal feelings, the woman had to compose herself and proceed with her work, pretending as if her life hadn't been upended. She waited 2 days for a call from Zach. When her husband finally arranged a meeting, Mary had a sinking feeling, thinking, this must be the end of my metropolitan fairy tale. Zach is probably going to ask for a divorce. Well, so be it. However, Zach didn't show up at the cafe alone. He was accompanied by a visibly nervous Denise. Zach apologized. Mary, I apologize for doubting your judgment. It turns out Joshua was a con artist. Getting him to confess took some effort, but my friend managed to find powerful people who could persuade Joshua to tell the truth. He admitted everything. The attack was just a psychological ploy. By helping him, we subconsciously felt like we had invested in him, so he didn't seem like a stranger anymore. And the business trip he claimed to go on was a lie. The tickets were actually printed in a photo studio. Joshua returned some of the money, but it doesn't look like we can expect much more. My mum doesn't want to report to the police. She's ashamed that she contributed to this deception. Denise took her daughter-in-law's hands and pleaded. Mary, my dear, come home. I promise no one will ever hurt you again. I made a mistake, and I hope you will forgive me. Please, come back. Denise, I bear no ill will towards you. It's your right to decide who stays in your house. But I'm not a toy to be discarded and then reclaimed. I'm grateful this situation helped me see your true feelings towards me. Zach also showed me a side of him I never knew. You know, stay in your apartment. I think I'll file for divorce, work for 2 weeks, and go home. As I can see, the housing problem has spoiled everyone in the capital. Despite Zach's efforts to mend their relationship, Mary remained determined. Her parents were always there for her back in her hometown, and she was confident she could find a man who would trust her unconditionally. Yvonne was overjoyed when she enrolled in medical school and got a scholarship. Her mother Sarah was equally elated. As a single mother with limited income, paying for tuition would have been impossible. This budgeted position was a dream come true. However, their happiness was short-lived. One evening, Sarah collapsed in the hallway upon returning from work. Fortunately, Yvonne was home and quickly called an ambulance. The responding doctor diagnosed a stroke. Yvonne found herself torn between the hospital and her studies. Mornings were spent at lectures, evenings at her mother's bedside. Sarah lay motionless and speechless like a vegetable, her open eyes brimming with tears. Despite the doctor's grim prognosis, Yvonne continually reassured and comforted her mother. It seemed a cruel fate for a woman of only 45, one who had worked tirelessly all her life to provide for her daughter, rarely resting. This was the harsh result of her selfless efforts. Yvonne wept as she left the hospital and visited a church
in hopes of divine intervention. Sadly, her prayers went unanswered, and Sarah was discharged home, still immobile. If Yvonne had thought she was in agony before, now her life had become a living hell. She felt suffocated by her circumstances. At home, her mother required constant care. At the medical school, missing classes risked expulsion, potentially crushing her dream of becoming a doctor. Nevertheless, Yvonne strived to manage it all. She soon developed a routine, balancing her mother's care with her studies. Kind neighbours suggested hiring a nurse, but Yvonne couldn't afford one. Her mother's meagre pension barely covered essentials. That's when Yvonne decided to find work. Many classmates worked night shifts as hospital orderlies, but Yvonne couldn't leave her mother alone at night. Instead, she took a job cleaning building entrances in the evenings. Working in 2 nearby buildings for 2 to 3 hours each evening, she earned enough to cover her mother's medications and basic groceries. One evening, an unpleasant incident occurred. As Yvonne cleaned the stairs, a woman and a young man entered. The man accidentally kicked over Yvonne's water bucket, soaking his expensive shoes. His companion gasped and berated Yvonne. "Why are you putting buckets here? It's impossible to pass by or drive by." "People don't drive through here," Yvonne replied calmly, wiping up the spill. "They walk, and should watch where they're going." "Look at her, Timothy. She's talking back instead of apologizing." "Why should I apologize?" Yvonne asked evenly. "Your companion spilled the water, creating more work for me. The bucket was in plain sight. I don't understand how he missed it." "You're right." The young man smiled sheepishly. "I was daydreaming. It's fine. Please forgive me." "Timothy, what are you saying?" the woman exclaimed. "This cleaner ruined your shoes. Do you know how much they cost?" "My dear, don't fret. We'll dry the shoes," he replied, then turned to Yvonne. "I apologize for causing you extra work." The girl nodded silently in response, but Timothy's companion, before she left, promised to get her in trouble. Of course, Yvonne did not take all these threats seriously, and even when the head of the Housing and Utilities Department called her and informed her that she had received a complaint, she was not worried. The girl explained to the chief what had happened. "Yes, I know, Miss Shortraw," sighed the man. "She blew everybody's brains out, and the neighbours, and our office. She's a scandalous, nasty woman, and she teaches somewhere. Okay, I understand everything about your fight, but try not to mess with her any more. She's a very unpleasant lady. She can complain to the mayor. It's happened before." "I see," Yvonne shrugged. "I'll try not to cross paths with her." Afterward, she had to meet Miss Shortraw at the house anyway, but they both pretended not to know each other. Miss Shortraw only cast disparaging glances in the girl's direction, and Yvonne noticed that with this Miss Shortraw came all kinds of young men. However, this did not concern the girl at all. It seemed that they would never cross paths again, but an incredible thing happened. In the new semester at the medical school, a new teacher came. It was Miss Shortraw, and she read a course of philosophy. The subject, of course, is not the most important in medical school, and therefore all the students did not take it seriously. Besides, they knew that no one had ever had any problems with passing philosophy before. True, it used to be taught by another professor, but that's the second thing. Why would a doctor need this philosophy? And unfortunately, everyone was wrong. Miss Shortraw demanded, and demanded. The students were terrified of the upcoming exam, and Yvonne, too, she realized that Miss Shortraw recognized her. The teacher looked at her unkindly, but still Yvonne hoped that she would pass, because she was preparing diligently. She wrote all the essays, wrote down the lectures, and even did not miss any of them. Yvonne generally studied well,
even though her schedule was exhausting. When the time came to take the exam, all the students were very nervous. But as it turned out, Miss Shortraw gave positive marks to all of them. True, the boys got better marks than the girls, but Yvonne was cut off at the root, although the girl answered her questions quite well. "Go on. Prepare yourself further," Miss Shortraw said with a slight smirk. Yvonne lowered her head and nodded in response. "Only I have great doubts whether you will pass the exam," Miss Shortraw added with a snaky smile. "It is better not to torture yourself and me. Do what you're best at. Wash the floors." Yvonne didn't answer anything this time. She just left the room, and her heart pounded in alarm. Would Miss Shortraw take revenge on her? But for what? For getting her lover's feet wet? But that would be absurd. Nevertheless, that's precisely what happened. Yvonne, the only one from the entire course, did not pass philosophy at the second or third attempt. A committee was appointed. Even the dean was surprised because Yvonne had passed all the other subjects well. And the most annoying thing was that Yvonne had learned everything, but Miss Shortraw kept piling her with additional questions. No, Yvonne answered them, but the teacher said with a sneer that it was not enough. And now Yvonne was preparing for the commission. It was very hard. For the 10th time she studied all the philosophy lectures, not forgetting to do all her daily chores, washing the entrances, taking care of her mother. Unfortunately, Sarah's condition wasn't improving. "Don't worry, Mummy, we'll get through this," Yvonne said while changing her mother's clothes. Truthfully, she had already given up hope and was mentally preparing to be expelled from the medical school. It was a shame, but what else could she do? Complain to the dean about Mrs. Shortraw? Who was Yvonne compared to the teacher? Just one of many students, and not a particularly diligent one, according to the administration. The time for the retake exam arrived. The commission consisted of 3 people: a young associate professor, Ms. Shortraw, and the head of the philosophy department, Mrs. Roche. All the students adored Mrs. Roche. She made her seemingly dull subject fascinating and wasn't harsh during exams. Unfortunately, she didn't teach Yvonne's course. Mrs. Roche, a handsome and pleasant woman in her 50s, was rumoured to have raised 2 children, a son and a daughter, alone after her husband left her for another woman. She lived a solitary life, which surprised many. Unlike Ms. Shortraw, who revelled in male attention, Mrs. Roche remained alone, despite her youthful appearance and charm. However, none of this mattered for the upcoming exam. Yvonne took the test at the department. In a small room, the committee waited. Miss Shortraw nodded towards the exam tickets. "Take one," she said. Yvonne hesitantly complied. What was she afraid of? She had studied everything, or so she thought. That damn question, the one she'd always avoided and ultimately forgotten in the chaos of preparation, was now staring her in the face. Yvonne sat across from the committee, frantically trying to recall anything relevant. The associate professor was engrossed in a magazine. Mrs. Roche gazed pensively out the window, and Miss Shortraw watched Yvonne with a smirk. 10 minutes left, Miss Shortraw said. "Or just leave now and accept the inevitable." Yvonne shuddered at the barbed words, shook her head, and pretended to write. Mrs. Roche glanced at her colleague and the student in surprise, then excused herself and left the office. She returned 2 minutes later. "Miss Shortraw, you're urgently needed in the dean's office," she announced. Miss Shortraw raised her eyebrows, but couldn't disobey. Once she left, Mrs. Roche approached Yvonne, glanced at the question, and spoke quickly. "Here, write down." She began dictating the answer. Yvonne, surprised, obediently wrote. As she did, she realized she did know the material. It had just been phrased differently. After dictating, Mrs. Roche returned to her seat. "You didn't see anything," she said to the associate professor. I didn't. The young teacher smiled, indifferent to both the subject and Yvonne. His mind was on his research. He was only there by chance. Miss Shortraw soon returned, looking puzzled. Mrs. Roche, I could have signed those papers later, she said irritably. No, it was urgent, the woman replied, then turned to Yvonne. Well, are you ready to answer? The girl nodded eagerly. As Yvonne answered, Miss Shortraw looked at her in surprise, then shifted her gaze to Mrs. Roche, her face contorting with anger. Did you let her cheat? She hissed. Absolutely not, Mrs. Roche smiled. We have been keeping a close eye on her. Isn't that right? The associate professor nodded in response. Yvonne passed philosophy, despite Miss Shortraw's insistence that she shouldn't get more than a C. It was still a victory. The teacher glared at Yvonne, but she didn't care. She wouldn't encounter Miss Shortraw again, or take any more of her classes. Yvonne whispered, Thank you, to Mrs. Roche, who pretended not to hear and simply walked by. Mrs. Roche was a fair and kind person. She had inquired about Yvonne's studies beforehand and realized that philosophy wouldn't be crucial for her future. Yvonne continued her studies without further problems during exams. However, life didn't get easier for her. Her mother remained ill, with little hope of recovery. Meanwhile, Miss Shortraw soon became embroiled in a scandal involving another affair. Her young lover left her, and Miss Shortraw tried desperately to win him back, even confronting his wife. When this became known at the medical school, the teacher was quietly asked to resign. Nothing more was heard about Miss Shortraw after that. Yvonne successfully graduated from medical school, but her achievement was overshadowed by tragedy. Her mother passed away quietly. Yvonne found herself alone. Living in an apartment filled with memories of her mother became unbearable, so she decided to move to the capital. She sold the apartment and left, disappearing from everyone's radar. Years passed. Mrs. Roche no longer worked at the medical school. She was nearly 70, not an exceptionally advanced age, as some colleagues still worked, but her health began to falter. At first, she attributed it to aging. Then, growing concerned, she consulted doctors. That's when they discovered a tumour in her brain. The exact nature of the tumour could only be identified after specialised tests. She needed surgery, which wasn't fully free. Unfortunately, the woman lacked the necessary funds. During a lifetime of work, she hadn't managed to save much. She decided to ask her children for help. Her son was doing well with his own car repair company, while her daughter worked in the travel industry. "Mum, how am I supposed to give you that kind of money?" exclaimed Alison, Mrs. Roche's daughter. "You know my husband and I have a mortgage, and my son attends an expensive school. We really don't have extra money. Ask Don." But her son also claimed he had nothing. All his money was tied up in the business. "Mum, why do you need to pay right away? Get on the waiting list. There should be quotas for such operations," was Don's only advice. Mrs. Roche felt deeply hurt. Her children seemed to have forgotten everything she had done for them. True, they had made their own way in life, but Mrs. Roche had given them a solid foundation. Her husband had left when Alison was 5 and Don was 7. The alimony was meagre and irregular. Mrs. Roche had deprived herself of everything to ensure her children were well fed and had all they needed. She always economized on herself. From the outside, Mrs. Roche always looked neat and tastefully dressed. A decent suit or shoes could last for years, but those wretched tights seemed to tear at the speed of light. Sometimes she couldn't afford to buy new ones. There was no money for a hairdo either. Thankfully, Mrs. Roche wore her hair in a bun. Her hair was gorgeous, her only wealth. No one would have guessed that she washed it with the cheapest shampoo and rinsed it with chamomile tea. Everyone thought Mrs. Roche wore minimal makeup as a style choice, but in reality, She simply couldn't afford good mascara or eyeshadow. Cheap cosmetics made her skin itch and her eyes water. She didn't wear a good perfume either, though she longed to. There was one fragrance she liked. Her colleague, Miss Shortraw, used it, but it was far too expensive. She didn't wear earrings, claiming she disliked having things hanging from her ears. The truth was, she couldn't afford to buy it, and there was no man in her life to give her such gifts. Yes, her salary as a department head wasn't enormous, but it was decent. However, Mrs. Roche had 2 children, and she alone was responsible for them, sometimes a little too much. She had paid for Alison's expensive language and math courses, so her daughter could easily enter her dream university. She had even taken out a loan to help Don with his first tyre shop, enduring financial bondage for nearly 5 years. And now, when their mother needed help, the children seemed to have forgotten everything. It hurt and offended her, and she couldn't decide which feeling was stronger, the pain or the offence. The pain wasn't just emotional. The elderly woman's head ached so severely it felt as if her skull might crack. Mrs. Roche resorted to the cheapest painkillers, as anything stronger required a prescription. Without an accurate diagnosis, no doctor would prescribe such medication, and there was no one else to help this poor woman. Her days passed in a blur. Each morning she took her pills and tried to do housework, but everything slipped through her fingers. The unknown was the worst part. What was happening in her head? How long did she have to live? Her children called and visited for tea as if nothing was wrong. Mrs. Roche fed them cakes she baked out of habit and chatted with them. She never asked about money again, and they remained silent on the subject. Occasionally, Alison brought herbs and supplements that were supposed to help, and that she bought during another trip abroad with her husband and son. Don increasingly talked about only his problems: rising prices, unscrupulous suppliers, insolent customers. Mrs. Roche listened, offering agreement when necessary, advice when asked, even sympathy. What else could she do? They were her children. She felt sorry for herself to the point of tears, but she never spoke of her troubles and pain in front of her son and daughter, and they didn't see it or sense it. Both Alison and Don somehow convinced themselves that their mother's problem wasn't really a problem at all. Then Mrs. Roche fainted. She had gone to the store for milk. The last thing she remembered was entering the supermarket. Suddenly, everything swam before her eyes. She felt dizzy, and then darkness engulfed her. Mrs. Roche woke up in the hospital. The young doctor explained at length that in her condition she couldn't ignore her health. She needed treatment. Yes, it would cost money, but health was more valuable. But where could she get the cursed money? She had worked honestly all her life, but what good had it done her? You see, we can perform diagnostic surgery for free, but it might only worsen your condition. You need special equipment and a highly qualified surgeon. Unfortunately, we can't offer that within the framework of your medical insurance, the doctor explained. I understand, Mrs. Roche sighed, but I have no money. What about children? Husband? Family? Relatives? Can't anyone help? Mrs. Roche barely shook her head, as it was still spinning. But what could she tell the doctor? That her children were suddenly out of that game? Her husband had left her long ago. She had no real relatives, and she couldn't ask acquaintances or colleagues for money. She didn't want to beg, as she saw it. No, it wasn't pride. It was simply how she'd always lived, solving her own problems. Even now in the hospital, Mrs. Roche didn't bother anyone, not even her children. She knew Alison was off again somewhere with her husband and son, while Don and his family were at the seaside. Why disturb them? She'd only spoil their mood, and her own. They wouldn't help anyway. After 5 days in the hospital, Mrs. Roche began preparing for discharge, believing nothing more could be done. But before she left, her doctor unexpectedly poked his head into her room. Dr. Alvarez genuinely wanted to help this kind elderly woman. A former professor of philosophy, he knew Mrs. Roche had worked at their medical school for years, almost a colleague, one might say. But there was nothing he could do. Everything he'd told her was the truth. And then, such luck. Mrs. Roche. The doctor began excitedly from the doorway. Dr. Kaufmann, a famous surgeon, is coming to our hospital tomorrow. From Germany. To be honest, I don't know much about him myself. I haven't had an opportunity to look him up online, so I came straight to you. I've heard from colleagues that he's an excellent neurosurgeon. He'll be consulting in our department tomorrow, just for the day. Can you imagine? Anyway, I've already scheduled an appointment for you. Why? Mrs. Roche shrugged weakly. He'll probably charge an exorbitant amount, being so famous. Still, his consultation won't be superfluous, the doctor insisted. Mrs. Roche only sighed. She had already given up, accepted. However long she had left, she would live. Why all this fuss? Nothing would help her. Yet to avoid offending the doctor and his desire to help, she agreed to the appointment. For this, Dr. Alvarez delayed her discharge by one more day. The next morning, the doctor practically flew into the room. Mrs. Roche, let's go, they're waiting for us. The doctor enthused, like a boy. Oh, it's so unexpected. Such a mix-up, really. I thought this surgeon was a man, but it's... An alien? Mrs. Roche smiled faintly. You're joking. That's a good sign. No, it's a woman. She's quite young, and apparently a very talented surgeon. We've even had a brief chat. Didn't you say this doctor is from abroad? Do we need to speak German? No German needed. She's our compatriot. Only her last name is her husband's. Dr. Alvarez smiled. In fact, it turns out that Dr. Kaufmann was born and lived in our city. Is that so? Mrs. Roche raised an eyebrow. Soon, she found herself sitting in the office of the famous neurosurgeon. As Dr. Alvarez had said, it was indeed a young woman. Slender and petite, one couldn't immediately guess she was a surgeon. Only her strong fingers and keen eyes betrayed her profession. Mrs. Roche also had the nagging feeling she'd seen this Dr. Kaufmann somewhere before. The doctor was silent, studying the medical history. Mrs. Roche, too, remained quiet, hesitant to ask anything. At last, Dr. Kaufmann put the papers aside and looked attentively at the old woman. Well, everything is clear to me, she said. The case isn't easy, but we can't delay. You need surgery. I won't be able to pay for this operation, replied Mrs. Roche, swallowing an unexpected lump in her throat. I've already told my doctor about it. I don't know why I came to you. I apologize for wasting your time. Did I say anything about money? Dr. Kaufmann raised her eyebrows. I'll operate on you for free. Free of charge? Gasped the elderly woman. But how? Is it possible? I was told it couldn't be. Expensive equipment, materials, plus your labour. Dr. Kaufmann lingered her gaze on the patient and smiled. Mrs. Roche, don't you recognize me at all? She asked. To be honest, I have a feeling we've met before, admitted the woman. Of course we have. Yvonne smiled again. Remember, 20 years ago, you were part of the committee examining a negligent student. I couldn't pass philosophy then, and you helped me. You sent the teacher, who disliked me, to the dean's office on some pretext and dictated the answer to the question. Do you remember? I remember, Mrs. Roche said faintly. Yvonne, I think it was O'Reilly. I remembered your last name for some reason. Miss Shawtraw was your teacher at the time. She once said in the department that she was annoyed by one of the cleaners who dreamed of becoming a great doctor, and she was sure to clip her wings. I tried to reason with her, but no way. Miss Shawtraw was vindictive. I don't know what happened between both of you. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Yes, it was me, answered Yvonne thoughtfully. Back then I really did clean the floors in the evenings after school. My mum was sick, and there wasn't enough money. It was hard once I spilled water on her lover's shoes, and that's how it all started. But it ended well, smiled Mrs. Roche. I'm overjoyed that you realized your dream. And not without your help, Yvonne smiled. Yes, it's funny, but I would have dropped out of the medical school if you hadn't helped me. I've been thinking about you all these years. I even wanted to thank you personally once, when I came to the city to visit my mother's grave. I visited the medical school, but they told me that you hadn't worked there for a long time. I thought I'd never see you again. And then I ran into you. Mrs. Roche, don't worry. I'm telling you, with all confidence, that everything will be fine. Today, I'll prepare the documents to transport you to the capital's clinic, where I'll be able to operate on you. But you're thinking about money again, smiled Yvonne. Don't think about it at all. I'll take care of all expenses. It must be costly. No more expensive than what you once did for me. Yvonne touched Mrs. Roche's hand. It's just my gratitude to an excellent person. Mrs. Roche nodded uncertainly in response. A few days later, she was flown by air ambulance to the capital, where Yvonne performed surgery on Mrs. Roche in one of the clinics. The tumour turned out to be benign but quite large, so Dr. Kaufmann had to do her best. But her knowledge, experience, and the latest equipment made this delicate work excellent. For a while, Mrs. Roche remained in the clinic for treatment and rehabilitation, with Yvonne visiting her regularly. Recently, Yvonne had been spending more time in her native country and was even considering moving back permanently. Yvonne shared her life story with Mrs. Roche. After graduating from the medical school, she moved to the capital, where she faced challenges, housing difficulties, and an autocratic head doctor. However, her fortunes changed when she met Benjamin, an ambitious businessman dreaming of building his own empire, though taxes and competitors often hindered his plans. Unexpectedly, Benjamin discovered he had a grandfather living across the ocean. This wealthy man, estranged from his daughter-in-law and grandson for years after his son's death, reached out to Benjamin as his health declined. "We are the same blood, you bear my surname," he wrote. Despite her initial reluctance, Benjamin's mother recognized this as an opportunity for her son and allowed him to go. Yvonne accompanied Benjamin abroad. Shortly after their arrival, his grandfather passed away, leaving his entire fortune to Benjamin. While Benjamin took the helm of a large company, Yvonne pursued her passion in medicine. After obtaining the necessary credentials, she began working in a clinic. Mentored by skilled surgeons, she quickly became an excellent specialist. Her continuous learning, valued opinions, and adopted practices led her to become a luminary in neurosurgery. Later, she opened her own clinic, but maintained ties with her homeland, practicing and consulting there. Yvonne and Benjamin now have a growing daughter, a beautiful home, and financial security. Yet despite their apparent success, they increasingly feel drawn back to their homeland. Benjamin's mother's refusal to move abroad has further influenced their thoughts of returning. "Yes, Germany is good, but home is better," Yvonne said with a smile, as she concluded her story to Mrs. Roche. "I believe everything will work out for you here too," the woman replied confidently. Yvonne had never inquired about Mrs. Roche's family, but one day she decided to broach the subject. After all, during the woman's 2-month stay in the capital hospital, Yvonne had been her only visitor. "They call," Mrs. Roche replied with a sigh. "Both my son and daughter. They ask when I'm coming home." It's not such a great distance from our hometown to here. Couldn't they have visited? You've been here for almost 2 months, Yvonne remarked. Mrs. Roche merely waved her hand and sighed. She wanted to keep silent, but couldn't. She confided in Yvonne about how her children had repaid her care and attention. Honestly, Yvonne, if it weren't for you, who knows how long I would have suffered, although the tumour was benign. For now, Yvonne replied tensely, her mind elsewhere. It would have surely turned malignant if it hadn't been removed, and before that, you could have lost your sight completely. That same day, Yvonne found Mrs. Roche's son and daughter's contact information in her documents. Emergency contacts the woman had listed. Yvonne called Alison first, explaining who she was and why she was calling. The surgery was complex, and she's about to be discharged. Yes, everything went well, but she should be under supervision for a while. All household chores are difficult for your mother now. Cleaning, cooking, even bathing. She'll need help for about 6 months. Are you prepared for that? If not, you should consider hiring a caregiver, Yvonne explained to Mrs. Roche's daughter. 6 months? Do you know how much caregivers cost? I can't afford that. Besides, Mum said she was feeling fine, Alison replied, irritation creeping into her voice. What? Can't even cook pasta on her own? Pasta. Perhaps she can manage, but Mrs. Roche's diet after such an operation needs to be quite different. Moreover, your mother needs positive emotions. Do you understand? I understand, but I'm not here to bright her mood. Okay, we'll figure it out, Alison replied dryly. Doctor, thank you so much for curing my mum. When will she be discharged? I'll come and take her home. Yvonne provided the date, although she disliked Alison's tone. She realised that she wasn't going to follow her advice. She'd bring her mother home and leave her in an empty apartment. At best, she'd only call in the evenings. Then Yvonne called Mrs. Roche's son. But Don, citing his busy schedule, said that Alison would handle everything. It would be easier for her as a woman. Especially since she was the daughter. Now it became clear that Mrs. Roche's adult children didn't really need her. Yvonne felt so sorry for her beloved patient. Such a good woman didn't deserve such treatment. Yvonne considered suggesting that Mrs. Roche stayed in the capital. She and Benjamin had an apartment here, and they could hire a nurse. But the doctor realised that her patient was already thinking of home, her own apartment, and was unlikely to agree. This proved true when Yvonne offered the option, explaining that in the capital, Mrs. Roche would receive better medical supervision. Yvonne, thank you for everything, but I'd rather go home. As you know, familiar walls help, Mrs. Roche replied with a sad smile. Yvonne didn't mention the conversation with the children, but the elderly woman realised there would be little help from either Alison or Don. On the appointed day, Alison came to pick up her mother. Yvonne warmly said goodbye to Mrs. Roche and they parted, agreeing to call each other regularly. When Mrs. Roche returned to her apartment, a woman arrived the same day, introducing herself as a caregiver. Her name was Mary. Did Alison hire you, or was it Don? Mrs. Roche asked, confused. Her children had, as expected, left her alone in the apartment, but without mentioning a nurse. No, the contract was signed by Yvonne Kaufman, Mary said, and presented all the necessary documents. Bewildered, Mrs. Roche called Yvonne. Dr. Kaufman, why are you doing this? Mrs. Roche said, as soon as Yvonne answered. You've already done so much for me, and a nurse. It's all so expensive. Mrs. Roche, it's worth more than money. Yvonne smiled into the receiver. Don't refuse. I'll be offended if you do. After all, if you hadn't helped me years ago, this wouldn't be happening now. Mary will stay with you as long as you need. Get well, Mrs. Roche. Mrs. Roche accepted Yvonne's help, realising it was indeed difficult for her to be alone. 6 months later, Mrs. Roche was as healthy as could be expected for her age. She and Yvonne, now living in the capital with her family, often called each other. Alison and Don called too, and Mrs. Roche was happy to hear from them. How could it be otherwise? They were her children, and she held no grudge. Because she was a mother, she forgave them. That's how her kindness came back to her. Help arrived from an unexpected source. It seemed like heaven's will, because good always returns.